Love to the grave. It is not uncommon for the ship of love to crash on the rocks of marriage. Married life does not always meet expectations. During falling in love, the world seems in a rosy light, and the beloved man is the limit of dreams. True attitudes are tested over time. Unfortunately, for most couples, the truth comes out too late, and when the matter smells of divorce, it turns out that it is not so easy to get out of codependent relationships. In such cases, people go through a severe crisis. Some don't dare to follow through. Others start a new life. Former lovers have a lot in common: the past, children, jointly acquired property, loans, and other circumstances. Dealing with these issues seriously undermines mental and physical health. Harmonious perception of the breakup by both parties is rare. That's when one thing remains paramount: not to lose your temper and make things worse. Vashti Seacat and Vashti Forrest, lovers from Kansas, who tied themselves in marriage on the beach in Belize. The young people planned the perfect life. They moved to Kingman, bought a house, and had 2 children. Each of them had a favorite job and got a professional vocation. Sooner or later, however, any fairy tale ends. Over time, outwardly harmonious relationships ceased to correspond to reality. Spouses quarreled and reconciled, and even tried joint psychotherapy. However, the events that occurred on the night of April 30th, 2011, put an end to their love story. Detectives had to understand what caused such an unexpected denouement. Was it the wife's unstable mental state, or her husband's uncontrollable sense of ownership? One thing was clear: the house fire was the result of an accident or a brutal murder. Love story. Vashti and Vashti met in high school. The girl stood out among her friends and was very pretty. Her boyfriend was an outstanding athlete. They loved each other very much and were always together. In 2004, young people got married, after which they decided to settle in Brett's hometown. Everyone in the neighborhood considered the family Seacat exemplary. The spouses raised 2 sons, 4-year-old Brandon and 2-year-old Bronson. The head of the family worked as a sheriff's deputy and also taught at the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center. Vashti was building a successful career as a communications representative at Cox Communications. No one who knew them doubted that they had a wonderful union, however. They just didn't really spread the word. The couple definitely had problems. From the moment they met, Brett had controlled Vashti. At first it was a slight pressure, but years later his overbearing character intensified. He was jealous of his wife and sometimes even suspected of cheating. At the same time, Vashti tried to please in everything. She was a kind and cheerful woman who took care of her family. She respected her husband and tried to keep the peace, but in doing so, she did not notice how she lost herself in her marriage. Her friends recalled that in recent years she changed a lot. She became thoughtful and uncommunicative. As it turned out later, Seacat limited her contact with loved ones. He didn't like sharing her with anyone, as he repeatedly stated, so Vashti would call and see her nearest and dearest in his absence. Brett also had a big grievance regarding her work. Vashti was a diligent employee and worked hard. She often stayed late in the evenings, which provoked conflicts at home. Brett did not share her desire to socialize and establish herself in her career. He believed that he earned enough to support the family alone. But his spouse thought otherwise. She wanted to be independent and contribute to the family budget. Besides, she loved her job and saw it as an outlet. Attempts at happiness. The man believed that his wife's fatigue after work greatly affected her emotional background. However, it is not known what affected Vashti's mental state to a greater extent: workload and increased responsibility or endless tension in the family. In the end, the young woman burned out and became depressed. In addition, the pills she had started taking were having a negative impact on her well-being. One day, Vashti decided to take a serious look at her health. She was complex about her appearance, or rather her lush forms. According to the results of tests, it turned out that weight gain provoked hormonal disorder. For natural weight loss, the doctor prescribed specialized drugs. However, the proposed treatment did not exclude some side effects, such as fatigue, increased irritability, and anxiety. It is likely that the treatment could have exacerbated the depressed state, and, as a consequence, caused serious consequences in the form of negative thoughts of self-harm. Vashti's family later confirmed that she was indeed depressed, but at the same time she tried to fight and live on, began to visit a psychotherapist, and since November 2010, in order to improve her relationship with her husband, she enrolled in family counseling. Final solution. Unfortunately, the list of mutual recriminations was growing day by day. Outside help did not help, the quarrels continued. Perhaps because the woman realized that the matter was heading for divorce, her depression worsened. It was difficult to see the collapse of a familiar way of life. She tried to be more out of the house, went out alone or with friends. She did everything to be alone with her husband less often. All in all, the decision to divorce was hard for her, but it was the best option for everyone. A few days before the tragedy, she saw a lawyer and signed the fateful papers. Vashti wanted to get custody of the children, but she was not against communication between the children and their father, but on one condition: the children would see their father in her presence. The fact is that Brett not only treated her harshly, but also the children. Despite their small age, he punished them for provinces and did not allow them to show weakness. The father believed that in this way he would raise real men, but at the same time clearly overreacted. On this ground in the family often happened quarrels. Kathleen Forrest, Vashti's sister, said that sometime before the decision to divorce, Vashti confessed a lot of things. She talked about her husband's behavior and the intolerability of the marriage, about her resentment and her desire to make things right, which never came to fruition. After listening to her, Kathleen concluded that Brett had all the characteristics of a narcissist and abuser. She had suspected this before, but after a frank conversation with her sister, she became convinced. A short time later, Vashti was gone. Before her death, she handed her husband a divorce petition. Fire. On April 30th, 2011, at 3:57 a.m., emergency services received a call. The caller identified himself as 35-year-old Brett Seacat and reported the incident. His wife, 34-year-old Vashti Seacat, set the house on fire and then took her own life. The man also added that there were children inside, but he managed to save them. He also tried to carry his spouse out. However, the entire building was engulfed in flames and he was unable to help her. The dispatcher took the call, urged him not to leave the children alone and not to enter the burning house again. When emergency services arrived on the scene, there was no one to rescue. After putting out the fire, rescuers went inside. On the second floor in one of the bedrooms on the bed was a charred corpse. The woman was lying on her left side as if sleeping. Her arms and legs were bent. Brett's version. After he had recovered a little from the shock, he was talked to by fellow police officers. After he calmed down, he explained more about what had happened. According to him, at around 3 a.m., his wife called him and said that if he wanted the boys, he should go upstairs and get them. He was sleeping downstairs on the couch that time. Brett did as Vashti asked. He figured she wasn't feeling well and the boys in the next room were bothering her. Going up to the second floor, he peeked in on the children who were sleeping peacefully. At the same instant, he smelled the odor of burning and further shots followed. With all his legs, the man rushed towards the noise to his wife's room. When he opened the door, he saw the bed on fire and his wife immovable on it. As he got closer, he realized what had happened. Everything around was splattered with blood, and the woman showed no signs of life. The fire was burning with unimaginable intensity. Brett held her against him, trying to lift her up, but because of the scalding flames, he couldn't do so. Then he made the decision to rescue the children and then go back for Vashti. He grabbed the sleepy children and carried them outside. He then put them in his car and called emergency services. While making the call, he did try to go inside the burning house. Brett covered his face with a wet napkin, but he couldn't get very far. The entire room was filled with smoke. He didn't recognize his surroundings and moved almost by feel. Somehow or other, the fire was stronger and forced him to surrender. The head of the family looked confused. When asked by the police what he thought had caused the fire, he explained the following. Vashti had been in an unstable emotional state lately, causing her to have bad thoughts on more than one occasion. She may not have been able to cope with them and put the plan into action. Brett also explained that before going to bed, they discussed the upcoming divorce with his wife. Finally, they decided on the division of property and child rearing. In fact, it was their last night together. It is possible that the woman was so upset that she decided to die. There was one thing I didn't understand. Why would she start a fire and endanger the children? Even if she did take care of them and asked her husband to take the boys, why destroy the house? At that point, there were no answers to these questions. What had happened did not add up to a coherent picture. The investigators had a difficult task ahead of them. They had to establish whether in fact a loving wife and mother of 2 children voluntarily left her life, or she was helped in this. Unconcealed suspicions. When Vashti's relatives learned of the tragedy, they contacted law enforcement officials. They demanded that the investigation be treated with special attention and that the events be viewed from the perspective of murder. The woman's relatives assured that she could not have committed arson and then taken her own life. Despite her difficult family situation and divorce proceedings, she loved life and her children. Undoubtedly, Vashti was going through a difficult time. Her sanity was shaken, but not to that extent. Moreover, the Forrests were convinced that a mother like her would never have risked the children's lives and made them homeless. Vashti was a loving and caring mother. Every day she would get up at 4 a.m. to prepare a fresh and natural breakfast. She was attentive to everything and had a big and pure heart that knew how to be compassionate. For an example, Kathleen recalled an incident in her life. One day her sister learned that a kindergarten boy had been diagnosed with cancer. The child could have been saved, but his family needed financial help. Vashti came to the rescue with a fundraiser. She began baking pancakes, which were in particular demand. After each trade, Vashti gave the proceeds to the boy's family. It was unlikely that such a woman would leave her children to fend for themselves. In addition, she made big plans for the future. Together with her sister, she planned a vacation in Mexico, made repairs to the house, and every evening after work hurried to her sons. After a visit to the doctor, Vashti Seacat thoroughly took care of herself. She started exercising, eating right, and began to lose weight. Finally, she was starting to like herself in the mirror. Just a week before this happened, she had updated her closet. All indications were that the deceased was determined to move on. The brother and sister asked detectives to take a closer look at Brett's personality and told them what they knew. Although Kathleen, Richard, and Vashti lived in different states, they were close to each other and tried to keep in touch. The family was aware of the problems their sister was facing and were not going to keep quiet. However, they were worried that because of Seacat's position, the local police might have turned a blind eye to what had happened. Therefore, they revealed that their sister had complained about threats from her spouse more than once recently. He was against the divorce and did not want to let Vashti go. The man said that he would do something to her and nothing would happen to him for it. He reasoned that given his police skills, he'd make it look like an accident and they'd believe him. Evidence. However, the investigators did not rush to conclusions and began to study the available evidence. And there was plenty of it in the case. First, during the examination of the scene, criminalists managed to find a lot of interesting things. Near the hearth of the fire was a canister of gasoline, indicating that the arson was, in fact, premeditated. Secondly, the incongruous position of the gun used to shoot the deceased. It was under her body, muzzle down. This raised a lot of questions. David Folletti, senior special agent in charge of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, stated, "If Vashti shot herself lying down, the gun would have fallen to the floor. If she was sitting up and shot herself, the gun should have remained on her right side. The position in which it was found just didn't make sense." Even more disturbing was the trajectory of the bullet. However, it took time for the experts to get to the bottom of it all. Fourthly, when examining the contents of the lady's purse, a notebook was found. One of the pages contained a farewell message. Vashti wrote that she couldn't fight anymore. For that reason, she had to say goodbye to her husband and sons. She bequeathed to Brett to take care of the children. She asked the boys to be strong and forgive her. Vashti promised to watch over everyone from heaven. Despite the obviousness of what had happened, there were many inconsistencies in the case. It was as if someone was trying to make it look like wishful thinking. Next, the authorities investigated the couple's life and interviewed the people around them. Family opinion. The Forrest family said that just a short time ago, Vashti served her husband with divorce papers, and just a couple days later, she died. They knew that Brett was pressuring her, but no one believed he could follow through. Everyone thought the dissolution of the marriage would be a protracted process at the very least. Vashti was afraid her husband would take the children away from her, so she put up with it for years. Everyone described him as uncommunicative and secretive. He had almost no friends, and colleagues at work considered Brett arrogant. He was the complete opposite of his wife. Eventually, her stamina reached its limit, and she made the decision to separate. Everyone knew what the man's reaction was. He was angry and canceled a planned dinner with friends. In response, Seacat stated that he would do anything to prevent his wife from seeing the children. Undoubtedly, such a prospect was frightening. So that same day, Vashti took the boys and spent the night at a friend's house. In this way, she wanted to give her husband time to step back and get used to the new realities. Vashti hoped he would pack up his things and leave home. But instead, he stayed. From what he said, he needed time to find a new place to live. Brett's speech touched Vashti's good heart. She hoped she could resolve the disagreement in a civilized manner, so she returned home the next day, full of hope that the dispute would be resolved and the divorce would be amicable. In principle, Brett himself did not hide it. He initially admitted that his spouse was worried about child custody. As a loving father, he did not want to part with his sons and was going to fight. However, allegedly on that ill-fated night, he and his wife reached an agreement. Unfortunately, on April 29th, the deceased did not communicate with anyone, and what was going on at their home is unknown. Witnesses. The testimony of a neighbor of the family shed light on the situation in the house. The witness said that on the night of April 30th, she was suffering from insomnia. At 3:15 a.m., the silence outside the window was broken by the sound of clapping. The words of the eyewitness made one wonder. It was unclear why Brett had called emergency services 42 minutes later. Brett was a police officer and knew full well that delay could have tragic consequences. In addition, the experts listened to his call again. The man's voice seemed reserved and cold. It gave the impression that he did not care. Then the investigators talked to the psychotherapist, whom the couple visited. The specialist said that Vashti was concerned about her husband's reaction and the threats she was receiving. She shared that during one of the arguments, her husband confessed that he dreamed of killing her. This statement frightened Vashti, but she did not believe that he was capable of such a thing. The therapist herself characterized Brett as a narcissist with latent psychopathic tendencies. Autopsy. By this time, the autopsy results on the deceased were in. Pathologists reported no traces of soot or smoke in the lungs, indicating that the woman died before the fire. Cause of death appears to be a gunshot wound to the head. But the strange thing was, it wasn't the only one. Pathologists found several other wounds to the chest and thighs, which is unusual for a man who voluntarily left his life. The toxicology report found that Vashti was not under the influence of any substances at the time of death. Suspect. Brett was eventually called in for questioning. He was extremely unhappy and did not understand why he was suspected. In the process, he explained that he loved his wife very much and was experiencing the sorrow of loss. He was left alone with 2 children and was mentally shattered. The officers then bluntly asked the co-worker if he was involved in the death of his spouse, to which Seacat replied that if he had wanted to kill her, he would have thought of something better. However, he was countered that he was well aware of how well fire destroys all evidence. "I would never burn our house down, much less put my children in a situation like that," Brett justified himself. About the threats to his wife, the suspect explained that it was a farce. Thus, he just wanted to hurt her feelings and make her worry. In turn, he insisted that he would never touch his beloved. When asked what provoked Vashti to start a fire in the house, he was evasive. Allegedly, she hated the place. Brett made it sound good, but no one believed him. The first time, he explained that he had run into his wife's room and tried to help. However, there was no evidence to support this. At that time, his appearance spoke to the contrary. There were no bloodstains, soot, or traces of fire on his clothes or body. In fact, he was in the very epicenter of the fire, and yet he remained unharmed. That's impossible. So he didn't go into the burning room and lied to make his wife look bad. Goodbye. A few days after Vashti's death, her funeral was held. The memorial service was held in front of the burned house. At the ceremony, gathered relatives and familiar people did not bypass the tragedy, and not indifferent citizens. All mourned the untimely passing of a woman and mother of 2 children. Brandon and Bronson were informed that the mother went to heaven. The little ones asked God to bring her back. Those who came spoke well of Vashti, remembering her character. When the rumors spread through the town, everyone found it hard to believe that she could leave her babies to be raised by a tyrant husband. The investigation into the case moved quickly. The pants Brett was wearing the night of the fire were sent for examination. It showed gasoline droplets on them. That was evidence against him. The laptop that miraculously survived was examined. It turned out that before the fire, several requests had been made from it on how to get rid of the evidence. In addition, a close examination of the scene revealed several traces of fire. So he acted with certainty. The handwriting examination of Vashti's suicide note revealed that the deceased's handwriting was forged. The trajectory of the bullet was examined in detail. The forensics revealed that the shot was fired from a distance. Vashti would have needed an unrealistic arm extension and bend to make the shot herself. Trial. Brett Seacat was eventually arrested on May 14, 2011. He was charged with murdering his wife, arson, and child endangerment. 2 years later, the trial began. The prosecution insisted on the defendant's guilt and presented all the available evidence in the case. They were so undeniable and sufficient that those present in the courtroom had no doubts about his involvement. As experts were invited specialists in handwriting, ballistics. Forensic experts and a psychotherapist also testified. Connie Suderman, a family counselor, admitted that hours after his wife's death, Brett called her. He admitted that he was responsible for her death. During the hearing, the defendant explained that his words were being misinterpreted. For 19 years, I was the one who protected her, but in the end pushed her to what I was protecting her from. So I believe Vashti's death is on my conscience, he explained. Brett expressed that in making the decision to pass away, their last conversation was fatal. After a number of forensic tests, it was discovered that the farewell note was forged by none other than the deceased's spouse. According to the prosecution, on the morning of April 29th, Brett had no intention of leaving home, but not for lack of another place to live, but for another reason. He had something terrible in mind. On the night of April 30th, when everyone was asleep, Brett took a .44 caliber Magnum pistol. He went into his wife's bedroom and shot her several times. Then he set the fire. Next, he carried the children out and contacted emergency services. The prosecutor cited a sense of property and a desire for revenge as the motive for such a brutal crime. The jury had 5 hours to reach a verdict. In the end, 37-year-old Brett Seacat was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with parole after 25 years for murder, 5 years in prison for arson, and 1 year for endangering the lives of his sons. The defendant disagreed with the sentence. He was so angry that he dared to tell the jury and the judge that they were going to hell. Life after. Time later, the defendant appealed, however, the verdict remained unchanged. After numerous trials, Vashti and Brett's children were given to the care of Kathleen Forrest. The fact is that there was a fierce struggle between the two families for the upbringing of the children. In the end, the court decision sided with the Vashti family. Currently, the convict is in a correctional facility located outside of Kansas. His transfer is due to the fact that former law enforcement officers do not serve time with criminals they may have put away. This is how the Seacat family's story ended tragically, a beautiful beginning and a monstrous ending. The angry man walked out of the house, slamming the door hard. He reached the driveway and stopped. He ran his hand through his black, disheveled hair several times. The man was visibly nervous and said something quietly under his breath, then walked briskly back toward the house. He tugged sharply on the doorknob and stepped inside. Picking up a baseball bat that was lying at the entrance, he walked bossily through the house and shouted violently. At his screams, a blonde-haired young woman ran out. As soon as she approached him, he struck her on the head with the bat. The woman fell unconscious, and instantly a pool of blood formed on the floor around her. The enraged, dark-haired man continued to strike the immobilized woman until his fervor subsided. It is hard to imagine, but it happens that in such a paradisiacal place of the planet as New Zealand can happen such bloody tragedies. After all, New Zealand is first of all a picturesque nature, with its unique flora and fauna, which creates a comfortable climate for people to live in. People living here have a high standard of living with a measured and calm way of life, where there is no corruption and crime is close to zero. But today our story will disrupt the tranquil life of Oakland and completely change the notion of a happy family. Carmen and Brad met on an ordinary day, which later became a fateful day for the two of them. Carmen Thomas was born on October 30th, 1987 in South Africa. Her father died when the girl was only 10 years old. Heavily bearing the loss, her family moved to relatives in the town of Whitby in the United Kingdom. But in another country, the long-awaited peace never came, and after a while her family moved back to South Africa. Carmen, who was over 18 years old at the time, decided to stay with her relatives and later moved to live in London. In London, Carmen completed her studies and earned a master's degree in marketing. She had a strong and mischievous personality that attracted people. Carmen was a loyal friend and comrade for many people, but a beautiful life in a large metropolis required a lot of expenses, and the girl had to work hard to ensure a decent standard of living. During the day, Carmen worked in the store as a marketer, and in her spare time she worked part-time in a gentleman's club. Despite her strange choice in the service industry, Carmen was a girl of strict rules and never allowed herself unnecessary and even more so undignified behavior, which was very much appreciated by important clients. It was there that she met an attractive and flamboyant man, Brad Callahan. Bradford James Joseph Callahan was born in New Zealand in April 1978. The boy's parents separated when he was 9 years old. Little Brad stayed with his mother, after which they moved to Australia. In 2001, Brad graduated from university and received an engineering degree in the construction industry. At the invitation of a large construction company, he moved to the UK, where he was offered a position as chief structural engineer for a large business complex. For important negotiations and added status, Brad turned to a gentleman's agency, and his choice fell on the beautiful Carmen. The man was intelligent, tall, black-haired, with bright dark eyes, but he could not afford a real relationship because of too much ambition and busy career. He had no free time for a permanent relationship. After a successful business dinner, Brad was conquered by the open and radiant Carmen. They continued informal communication, which was repeated again and again. After a while, they formed a good friendship, which later grew into love. The candy bouquet period flew by very quickly, and the lovers began to live together. Their life together was based on trust and care. They sincerely supported each other and looked absolutely happy. After a while, Carmen became pregnant, and Brad decided that the best solution for them would be to return to New Zealand, to a country with clean air and a measured course of life. They returned to Auckland. In March 2005, Carmen and Brad had their son Jack. Jack brought more joy and happiness into their lives. From the first days, Carmen and Brad took care of his safety and provided everything they needed for his happy childhood. To them, Jack was the most important thing in their lives. However, with the birth of their son, serious disagreements arose in their relationship. The first misunderstandings appeared because of the upbringing of the child. The relationship between the lovers became turbulent and unstable, and after 3 years they parted, but retained joint custody of the child. The breakup was difficult for both of them, but they sincerely tried to keep a good relationship for the sake of little Jack. Wanting support and wanting to be surrounded by family, Carmen and Jack moved in with Colin, Carmen's half-brother, who also lived in Oakland. Gradually, emotional balance returned to Carmen, and she began a new life without Brad. In 2008, Carmen moved with her young son to a house on a neighboring street to Brad's so that the son would be closer to his father. The young woman, who lost her father at an early age, sincerely wished that her child would always have a father around as much as she could. Despite this decision, many of Carmen's friends and family thought the couple still had a good friendship, but they only spent time together for Jack's interests. However, life went on. Carmen and Brad tried to find happiness separately again. Brad continued to work as a construction engineer, and in May 2009 he started a new relationship with a girl and even got engaged. Carmen was busy raising her son and resumed her services in the Gentlemen's Club, which quite hurt Brad. He sincerely believed that the mother of his child should never again be interested in dubious earnings. This disagreement became a boiling point in their good relationship. With each passing day, the situation grew more heated. Carmen gave ultimatums to Brad, and he in turn simply ignored the requests of the former lover. Nevertheless, Brad entered into a new marriage and was preparing to become a father again. New financial obligations directly reflected on the alimony, which he paid under the agreement Carmen for the maintenance of Jack. The money was the last straw in a series of scandals. On March 19, 2010, neighbors called the police. The police officers arrived and responded to an incident of domestic violence. Carmen attacked Brad during another quarrel and received a warning. The relationship finally deteriorated. Arguments did not stop even at a distance. Each new question regarding Jack was perceived by each party in the bayonet and with aggression. Once loving parents for a long time could not agree on what school Jack should go to, and it again led to a number of unsolvable problems and a chain of scandals. On June 29, 2010, Brad again came to Carmen's house to make a new written agreement to pay child support and to discuss a new school for Jack. Carmen was not satisfied with the document, and she kicked Brad out of the house, yelling in the wake that Jack was not his son. Brad left. 2 weeks later, Brad tried to speak to Carmen again, but she did not make contact. On July 13, 2010, he reported Carmen Thomas missing to the police. The police took the report and began searching for the missing woman from video camera images and interviews with neighbors. Reconstructing the chronology of events since the last communication between Carmen and Brad, investigators found out some important details that should help in the search for the woman. They managed to find out that on June 29th, a surveillance camera recorded Carmen at a supermarket near her home. While inspecting the rented house where Carmen lived with Jack, the lack of a garbage can on the outside caught the attention of police. Inside the house, there were also traces of blood on the front door, on the washing machine, near the sink and shower. Forensic scientists used luminol to detect traces of blood left at the crime scene because it reacts with the iron contained in blood hemoglobin. The multiple patterns that appeared confirmed the presence of blood on the bathroom door and on the floor. The landlady told investigators that on June 29th, she heard loud screaming followed by prolonged crying and moaning. Recalling that day, she said she knocked on Carmen's door, but no one answered. She had to look out the window. She saw a street trash can and an overturned fabric horse, which is a drying rack usually made of wood or metal for drying clothes. Startled, the landlady called her husband, but while she waited for him to arrive, Brad walked out of Carmen's house and into the driveway. He was carrying soiled clothes in his hands, and upon seeing the landlady, Brad rushed to explain that Carmen had become ill after a medical procedure and had vomited blood. However, the landlady noticed Brad's condition. He looked like he had just taken a shower. The woman had no reason to disbelieve the man's story and did not call the police. The search continued, and Carmen's cell phone caught the attention of the police. Messages were being sent from her phone on a regular basis, but the manner of communication and tone of the messages were different and did not resemble Carmen's previous manner of communication. The outgoing messages and calls continued until July 10th. Where did the woman go if she needed medical help, and why? The investigators did not have to look for answers to these questions for long. During further investigation, Carmen's car was found. In the back seat of the car was found luggage, clothes, and other belongings of the woman. The examination of the seized suitcase on some of the things were found traces of blood. A note was also found in the car indicating that Carmen owed money to the agency where she worked. In the glove compartment, an envelope with Misty's name on it and the sum of $270. Police Inspector Mark Benefield, after finding traces of blood in Carmen's car, first raised the possibility that the woman had been murdered. Police searched the countryside southeast of downtown Auckland for the body of Carmen Thomas after a new report that her car was spotted around the time she went missing, but the search was inconclusive. The investigation and search for the woman continued. When investigators examined Carmen's and Brad's phones at the same time, they discovered both phones had been nearby the entire time they were being searched, and Carmen's phone was not found connected to a cell tower in Hamilton. Going forward, one of the most important pieces of evidence was the missing trash can. It remained to be seen if it could be the same bin that had disappeared from its place near the house, and that a neighbor had seen through her window on the day Carmen disappeared. But what did the trash can need to be inside the house for? The police did not refute the idea of the worst possible outcome and rechecked Brad's cell phone and spending by examining his bank card details and traced his shopping list. On June 30th, Brad Callahan, a meat cleaver and a large plastic container, as well as several garbage bags. By scrutinizing Brad's daily routine, police identified some exceptional events that did not fit into the young father's daily to-do list. It turned out that on one workday, Brad arrived at the construction site very early and walked alone around the property for a long time. It was strange, but not so strange that the workers who saw him would start reporting anyone about such an early presence of a supervisor at the construction site. Based on the evidence gathered, such as Carmen's cell phone and questionable purchases, Brad went from victim to suspect. Police believed that Brad Callahan killed his former lover by hitting her several times in the head and carefully hiding the body. On September 21st, Brad Callahan was arrested on charges of murdering Carmen Thomas and attempting to change the course of justice. He pleaded not guilty and is scheduled to stand trial. In a fateful coincidence, Brad's second son from a new lover was born at the time of his incarceration, which caused a wave of emotion and resentment in the young father who was in custody. The man broke down, and 9 days after his arrest, he pointed out to investigators the burial place of Carmen Thomas. Brad thought he had come up with the perfect plan, part of which was to make it appear that Carmen had gone to Hamilton and never returned. He was absolutely certain he had succeeded, but life made adjustments. Under questioning, he detailed the chain of events from that fateful day. After a bad conversation, Carmen kicked Brad out of the house, yelling in the wake that Jack was not his son. Brad left, but 5 minutes later, he came back into the house and hit Carmen in the head with a baseball bat with such force that she immediately fell unconscious. Blood spurted from her wound, staining the floor a bright red. Heavy breathing filled the room, and Brad stood over the body of his victim with a wild scowl in his eyes. He realized he had just done the irreparable, but he couldn't stop. In a fit of anger and resentment at Carmen's words, he threw several punches again. He knew that his act carried irreparable consequences, but everything remained in the shadow of his insane obsession. Memories flashed before Brad's eyes, happy and endless memories that were now gone forever. Brad knew that his life would be forever changed after that disastrous moment, and that he would not be able to get back everything that was, but it did not upset him at all, because by such an act he had solved his main problem, and Jack was now only his. Having come to his senses, Brad took a shower and then quietly left Carmen's house. In the days that followed, he sprang into action to get rid of Carmen's body and cover up the crime. Callahan called his friend and arranged to meet him outside a supermarket. He asked him to buy 3 black garbage bags, a bottle of kerosene and cleaning products, and waited for him outside the store, hoping to avoid suspicion. Brad then went back into the apartment and cleaned it up. He carefully wiped up the blood spatter and then wrapped the body in a bag and took it out in a trash can. In the following days, the defendant dismembered Carmen's body into 8 pieces to prepare it for disposal. He cut Carmen's legs from her torso at the hip joints. Each leg was cut through the knee into 2 pieces. Her arms and head were also severed from her torso. On July 3rd, he met a good friend at a boat ramp in Oahu Bay, near downtown Oakland. He told him that he had killed Carmen during an argument and needed help disposing of the body, but an attempt to dump the remains into the sea failed due to the friend's refusal to provide a boat. Over the next few days, he drove to Waitakere Ridge in West Auckland and buried the containers in a shallow grave. On July 7th, he drove Carmen's car to Hamilton and abandoned it in a hotel parking lot. He put a suitcase of clothes and several other bags of her personal belongings in the car to give the impression that the woman wanted to leave. But in his haste, he overlooked the fact that the suitcase also contained bloody clothes. After getting rid of the car, Brad began sending text messages from her cell phone to give the impression that Carmen was still alive. The criminal texted her friends, saying she wasn't feeling well and had been in bad shape for days. But Brad's perfect plan backfired on him. On October 1st, police went to the burial site Brad had indicated and discovered the body. Carmen Thomas's remains were found in plastic containers. They were carefully removed from a makeshift grave on Waitakere Ridge. An autopsy determined that Carmen Thomas had died from multiple blows to the head, with the fatal blow causing a compressed skull fracture. After multiple forensic examinations, Carmen's body was released to her family for burial. On October 13th, a private funeral was held at Green Lane Christian Center for Carmen Thomas, a young mother, a cheerful, kind, and successful woman. Little Jack, who all along had waited and hoped to see and hug his mom, was only able to hug and kiss her white casket. On February 8th, 2011, the first court hearing for Carmen Thomas took place. Judge Wenning found the crime committed was unintentional and took into account Brad's explanation that he acted on emotion. He acknowledged that it was done in a fit of rage, but Judge Wenning was less lenient when it came to the cover-up. On May 26, 2011, Brad Callahan was newly charged with attempting to change the course of justice. A summary of the police case shows that at 8:45 a.m. on July 29, 2010, Callahan struck Mrs. Thomas several times in the head, resulting in her death. He then texted a friend to bring 3 garbage bags and a bottle of kerosene. During the ensuing period, Callahan dismembered Miss Thomas's body into 8 pieces to prepare it for disposal. On November 25, 2011, a retrial was held. Police officers who had been working on the case filled the High Court in Auckland when Bradford Callahan unexpectedly made 2 guilty pleas. Brad Callahan, who had previously denied guilt, suddenly admitted to murder and attempting to change the course of justice after Carmen's death. The judge said it was one of the most serious cases of attempting to pervert the course of justice, calling Brad's actions just about the most serious case of attempted perversion of justice there can be. The judge also felt the murder of Carmen Thomas was brutal but not so brutal as to result in the harshest sentencing laws. The 33-year-old man was sentenced in Auckland High Court, where a large public gallery was filled with Thomas's friends and family, including her parents, who were visiting from South Africa. Judge Venning sentenced Brad Callahan to life imprisonment for murder and 6 years in prison for attempting to pervert the course of justice. He also condemned the lengths Callahan went to in order to cover his tracks. The sentences are to be served concurrently. Judge Venning also said the minimum sentence for the perverting the course of justice charge was insufficient to bring Brad Callahan to justice. Mr. Callahan passed judgment on himself by his actions that day, and it had a devastating effect on 2 families, said Detective Inspector Mark Benefield. Callahan's supporters left court without comment. In a statement, the Thomas family said nothing can bring their Carmen back, and they are still angry because of it. But they are grateful that Brad will be away for an extended period of time so he can reflect on the enormous damage he caused to their own son in the first place. Carmen Thomas's mother, Teresa Scott, told the court in a victim impact statement that she felt completely destroyed by what happened to her daughter. After the verdict was announced, the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Inspector Mark Benefield, told the court that the justice done is the result of hundreds of hours of police work over the past 10 weeks since Carmen Thomas was reported missing on July 13, 2010. Also, Detective Mark Benefield, during the interview, explained what the work to find Carmen consisted of. He explained that early on in the missing person investigation, they determined that Carmen was most likely murdered. Then the work of gathering evidence, as well as researching information, was carefully conducted. This required a great deal of time and effort to gather, and it was also necessary that proper legal procedures were followed. The detective reported that over the last few weeks, close cooperation with the defendant's employer had not been finalized. Attempts to further investigate part of the Victoria Street construction site would continue in order to find any evidence that might assist the investigation. Until today, we have been unable to comment on media reports about our activities at the facility because we have been very sensitive to the issues of litigation and preemptive contempt of court, said Mark Benefield. He did not rule out the possibility of further arrests and charges in connection with Carmen's death in the near future. Brad Callahan had the courage to take responsibility for his actions in this tragic saga, and he pleaded guilty to 2 charges. But that will in no way change what he did. For the hearts of Carmen's loved ones are broken, their world shattered. Living each new day without Carmen, each of her close family members feels completely destroyed. We will never forgive him for what he did to our family, said Carmen Thomas's mother, Teresa Scott. I could forgive someone for taking a life under certain circumstances, but I can never forgive this man for being able to strip a body and hide it in containers, added her stepfather Wayne. Callahan's attorney Stuart Grieve said his client acted responsibly and does not intend to file a motion. Can a sentence with parole eligibility after 13 years and 8 months be called a ridiculous miscarriage of justice? Obviously, since New Zealand only records about 50 murders a year for the entire country, any crime that is a little out of the ordinary is covered extensively by the national media, as are the court cases for those crimes. It's possible that there was an overbearing bias against the victim at trial because of her line of work. But even if Carmen was antagonistic and pissed Brad off, we don't blame the victim for having her life taken from her, do we? If Brad had wanted sole custody of his son, he likely would have used this prejudice about Carmen's work and gotten his way because he had the opportunity. Instead, he beat her to death and tried to cover it up. In this situation, we are not diagnosing, we are only speculating. In summarizing this gruesome story, the same question comes up repeatedly. It is understandable that in a fit of rage and uncontrollable anger, a person can commit irreparable acts. But what feelings can a healthy person have when he comes up with a plan to dismember a once tenderly loved person? Little Jack Callahan is currently living in another town under an assumed name in the temporary care of his grandmother. He doesn't know that his daddy took his mom's life and must never find out because it wasn't his fault. Absurd. The case of Anna Walsh, a horrific event in the basement of a family home. For over a year now, an investigation has been ongoing into the mysterious disappearance of a young woman and mother of 3 children, Anna Walsh. In January of the previous year, the case was reclassified as a brutal crime, although the body of the missing 39-year-old American woman of Serbian descent has yet to be found to this day. Her husband, Brian Walsh, who had previously encountered legal issues for fraud, was arrested on charges related to her disappearance. No one could have imagined that this individual could be responsible for ending the life of the mother of his sons. It's noteworthy that the Walsh family appeared to be quite prosperous, successful, and happy on the surface. Moreover, the couple was not in want, living in a luxurious home, and could afford anything they desired. However, few were aware of what happened behind the closed doors of this large and beautiful house. Even the person closest to Anna, her mother, did not realize the deadly danger her daughter was in. Interestingly, Brian managed to woo Anna away from her previous husband years ago in a rather unique manner. So unique, in fact, that the woman and her first husband even sought police protection from harassment and threats. Nevertheless, she eventually left with Walsh, to whom she was married for over 7 years. But what happened that led the family head to decide to rid himself of his wife? And what did he do to her? Who was Anna Walsh? Anna Lubicic, who later became known as Anna O'Neill following her first marriage, was born on April 18, 1983, in the Serbian capital of Belgrade. Here, she spent her formative years, growing up with her younger sister in a cultured family. Her academic journey led her to the 5th Belgrade Gymnasium, where she excelled as one of its standout students. Pursuing higher education, Anna attended the esteemed Belgrade Research University, the most historic and expansive university in Serbia. Her academic pursuits included a deep dive into foreign languages, culminating in a master's degree in French language and literature. At 22, with her diploma in hand, Anna sought broader horizons and career prospects in the United States, a move fully supported by her family. In 2005, she embarked on her American dream. Settling in the U.S., Anna aimed to further her education in hospitality management. She took on administrative roles at prestigious hotels, notably the Inn at Little Washington in Virginia, a part of the elite Relais and Chateau hotel circle. Anna's warmth, approachability, and sense of duty saw her swiftly ascend the professional ladder, garnering respect from her peers and supervisors alike. Multilingual and adept at resolving conflict, her innate charm and charisma allowed her to form connections with ease. Beloved by colleagues and blessed with a burgeoning circle of friends, Anna seized every chance to shine. She became a U.S. citizen, retaining her Serbian nationality, enjoyed a high income, and invested in her own property and car. Her travels broadened her horizons further, and her career flourished, leading to a promotion to senior manager. Anna's intelligence, beauty, slender frame, and radiant smile attracted many admirers. During her tenure at the Wheatley Hotel in Lenox, Massachusetts, she found love with Marcus O'Neill, the establishment's head chef. Their romance led to marriage in 2009, and Anna adopted her husband's last name. Who is Brian Walsh? Brian Paul Walsh was born in July 1975 in Boston, Massachusetts, into a well-known, affluent, and respected family. His father, Thomas Walsh, was a distinguished neurologist who worked at one of the state's leading hospitals, where he headed a department and also taught at a prestigious medical university. From a young age, Brian was the quintessential spoiled child, luxuriating in wealth and never knowing the word no. He attended one of the best private schools, wore expensive branded clothing, and lived a life of ease. Despite his parents' efforts to provide him with the best education after finishing school, he failed to stay enrolled in any of the 3 prestigious colleges his father had arranged for him to attend. Nevertheless, Brian was far from foolish. His peers remembered him as cunning, calculating, and quite aggressive. He always found a way to get what he wanted one way or another. Brian was known for his extraordinary, even obsessive desire for money and a luxurious lifestyle, and he was extremely reluctant to part with his funds. In his youth, he often borrowed money from friends, only to never return it. During his college years, he would invite friends to the most luxurious restaurants, then, through various schemes and manipulations, ensure that others always paid his share of the bill. For many years, Brian was estranged from his father, up until the elder Walsh's death in 2018. The rift in their relationship began after the ungrateful son fraudulently withdrew nearly $1 million from Dr. Thomas Walsh's personal account and simply disappeared with the money. The father did not report his son to the police and even tried to persuade him to return the money voluntarily. When Brian refused, Thomas ceased all communication with him. By the time of this egregious theft incident, Brian's parents had long been divorced, and his father had another family and decided to permanently erase his eldest heir from his life and his will. However, when Thomas passed away, Brian immediately made his presence known and even filed a lawsuit, claiming that the will left behind was forged by the doctor's widow and younger children to cheat him out of his rightful inheritance. Naturally, he was unable to prove anything or receive any part of the estate. Moreover, those who knew Brian described him as greedy, malevolent, and quite cruel, with a tendency towards violence and an inability to control his emotions. He achieved everything by force, and during bouts of anger, became dangerous. According to some reports, in the late 2000s, Walsh underwent treatment in a psychiatric clinic where he attempted to curb his bursts of rage, and it was then that he was officially diagnosed with sociopathy. A truly peculiar love story. The future spouses met in 2014, a time when Anna was working as a senior reservation manager at the Wheatley Hotel in Massachusetts. At that moment, she was married to Marcus O'Neill, who was employed there as well. Brian was among the hotel's guests, and he was immediately taken by the attractive young woman. The fact that Anna was already married did not deter Walsh in the slightest. He began to show her attention that grew increasingly insistent. Accustomed to getting his way from a young age and not one to accept refusal, he began to pursue Anna relentlessly. He managed to obtain her phone number and even her home address, where she lived with her husband, turning their lives into an absolute nightmare. In 2015, the O'Neills found themselves compelled to ask the police for protection against Brian's incessant harassment, which persisted day and night. He constantly sought out Anna, called her at work, sent messages to her personal phone, and demanded she divorce her husband to be with him. The situation escalated when Walsh threatened to harm Anna and her husband if she did not leave with him. What happened next remains unclear, including why Anna eventually changed her mind. However, a year after seeking police protection from Walsh, she unexpectedly divorced her husband. Moreover, a few months later, Brian became her second officially wedded husband. The newlyweds settled in a luxurious home in Cohasset, Massachusetts, located about 20 miles southeast of Boston, in an upscale and well-appointed neighborhood. In this marriage, they welcomed 3 sons in quick succession. The boys were born a couple of years apart, and at the time of their mother's disappearance, they were 6, 4, and 2 years old. Anna did not consider taking maternity leave and successfully juggled work with motherhood, continuing her upward career trajectory. She assumed the position of regional general manager at Tishman Speyer, a real estate company, where she earned a high salary and effectively became the primary breadwinner for the family. As her job frequently took her to Washington, D.C., she also purchased another home there, registered in her name, where she stayed during business trips. During these times, she relied on visiting nannies to help care for her children. The fraud case against Brian Walsh. What was the head of this large family doing while his wife was both expanding their family and building her career? Brian was unemployed. The $1 million he had once taken from his father was dwindling, and everything his wife acquired was wisely registered in her name. Brian was actively seeking effortless income sources. Before marrying Anna, Brian had spent some time in South Korea, where he befriended a very wealthy individual whose family owned an impressive art collection. Upon returning to the United States, Walsh maintained this connection, and his friend unexpectedly asked for his help in selling several paintings by the iconic artist Andy Warhol. Brian eagerly agreed, but decided not just to sell the artworks for a commission, but to truly profit from the transaction. He had access to a series of abstract paintings by the great artist, collectively titled Shadows. He appraised each painting, obtained the necessary documentation, including authenticity certificates, and then decided to create copies of both the images and the accompanying documents. Walsh approached artists who made precise replicas of the paintings. He convinced the artists that he needed these copies as a backup, since each of the original works was worth about $250,000. For several years, the fraudster successfully copied and sold fake paintings as originals to collectors from various countries, until one of his buyers, an art expert specializing in Andy Warhol's work, quickly identified a forgery and sued the fraudster. The FBI took on the investigation, and in April 2021, the suspect pleaded guilty to selling counterfeit art. He was placed under house arrest after his lawyer negotiated a deal requiring him to return the proceeds from the sale of the paintings to the buyers to avoid actual prison time. Brian's movements were significantly restricted, but he was allowed to leave his house. Twice a day, he could drive his children to and from their educational institutions. Additionally, he had 2.5 hours in the morning to visit stores, pharmacies, dry cleaners, and a few other places in his area to purchase necessities. The list of these places was limited and approved in an official document. The mysterious disappearance of Mrs. Walsh. On December 31, 2022, the Walsh family was preparing to ring in the new year together in the comfort of their home. Present were just the spouses and their 3 sons. Due to their young ages, the boys went to bed early, leaving Anna and Brian at the dinner table. That day, Anna made her last post on social media, extending her greetings and noting ambiguously that the year had been challenging. But she and her husband remained united. Anna was scheduled to fly to Washington, D.C. for work on January 3rd, but on January 4th, her employer, Tishman Speyer, reported her missing to the police. She had failed to show up for work, missed closing a crucial deal, and her phone had been unreachable for several days. Independently of Speyer's actions, her husband also reported her missing, expressing his concern that he had been unable to contact her for several days. According to Brian, he last saw Anna on January 1st. He claimed she woke him up early in the morning, saying that there were some issues at work, and her boss had requested her to come in earlier than planned. After that, Mr. Walsh believed his wife headed to the airport with just a few belongings. However, inconsistencies in the case soon emerged. Firstly, Anna hadn't purchased, changed, or reserved a flight ticket for January 1st, nor had she canceled her flight scheduled for January 3rd. Secondly, she didn't appear at the airport on either January 1st or 3rd. Thirdly, how did she leave the house? Her personal car was still in the garage, and she hadn't called for a taxi. Brian suggested she might have hitchhiked, but this theory sounded far from convincing. Brian's statements and behavior raised many questions. His accounts were inconsistent, and he didn't seem particularly troubled by the unfolding events. Unable to contact the mother of his children for more than 3 days, he only reported her missing on the 4th day, and only after her workplace called. Investigation and arrest of the suspect. From the outset, Mr. Walsh was considered a primary suspect, yet law enforcement lacked sufficient grounds for his arrest or a warrant to search their family home. They conducted only a cursory inspection with the homeowner's permission, which yielded nothing. Brian claimed he had been living a normal life during those 3 days, visiting usual stores and tending to household chores. However, verifying his claims proved difficult. Whenever he left the house, he forgot his phone, which, according to him, was often taken without permission by his older children to play games. On January 5th, the police made a public appeal through television, displaying a photo of Anna and requesting anyone with information about her whereabouts or fate to immediately contact law enforcement. Yet, no witnesses came forward. The last time Anna was known to have made calls was to her mother and sister on December 31st, making her husband the last known person to have seen her. Surveillance camera footage from the neighborhood provided no leads. Anna was not captured on any cameras on the morning of January 1st, as if she had never left her home. On the contrary, her husband was recorded leaving and returning several times, but it was impossible to determine his destinations. Walsh's claim of a supermarket visit was debunked. His vehicle wasn't seen on any footage en route, nor was he spotted in the store. It wasn't until January 8th that Brian was arrested for providing false statements and taken in for questioning at the station, while his home was finally searched. It was discovered that on January 1st, he had gone to a hardware store in a different area, not on the list of approved locations he could visit under house arrest conditions. There, he spent nearly $500 on a significant quantity of cleaning supplies, plastic sheeting, duct tape, a mop with a bucket, and utility rags. He paid in cash, presumably hoping his visit would go unnoticed. Horrifying discoveries in the family home. During the search, at first glance, nothing out of the ordinary or suspicious was found in the home. Everything was in its place, with no signs of struggle or bloodstains detected. However, when law enforcement descended into the basement, there was no longer any doubt. This was the scene of a gruesome crime. There, smeared bloodstains were visible everywhere, and among the old clutter, a bloodied knife and saw wrapped in towels were hidden. Previously, Walsh had admitted that on January 3rd, he visited his mother's home, located on the other side of town. He claimed he had violated his house arrest conditions because his mother needed help with household tasks due to her deteriorating health. But after the grim discoveries in the basement, police suspected that on his way, the man could have disposed of evidence or parts of his deceased wife's body. All the trash bins in the area where the spouses lived, as well as along the route to his mother's house, were inspected. These searches yielded results, and in one of them, a kitchen hatchet with traces of dried blood and several blood-stained towels, similar to those found in the Walsh's basement, were discovered. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood in the basement, on the towels, knife, hatchet, and saw, belonged to the missing Anna, dispelling any remaining doubts about her demise. Search history reveals chilling intent. Police seized a laptop belonging to Mr. Walsh, as well as a tablet owned by the couple's eldest son from the Walsh residence. The search history on these devices left investigators in disbelief. Weeks before his wife's disappearance, Brian was actively searching online for information about the most favorable states for divorce in terms of property division. He also sought information on whether he could lay claim to the second home in Washington, D.C., owned by Anna and registered solely in her name, thereby uncovering a possible motive for the crime. Regarding the tablet, the first query made around 4 a.m. on January 1st was, how long does it take for a body to start decomposing? This was followed by nearly 24 searches on how to dispose of a body, how to clean up blood traces, how to dismember a body, whether a body could be identified if the teeth were removed, how long DNA traces last, and whether a person could be charged with a crime if the body was never found. All this information was searched on his young child's tablet, the child of the woman he mercilessly dealt with. By January 3rd, Brian was already searching, how and when can someone inherit the property of a person who has disappeared? Clearly, he was confident he would evade punishment and was preparing to claim the inheritance. Charges and trial. On January 18th, Brian was formally charged with the murder of his wife, despite the fact that her body or any remains had not been found. Prosecutors believe that on the night of January 1st, Brian intentionally or accidentally took his wife's life and then decided to dispose of her body, by dismembering it in the basement of their home. He then packaged the body parts in plastic and over the following days discarded them in trash bins across different parts of the city. The area around the Walsh residence, as well as within a couple of kilometers, was thoroughly examined for evidence. Nearby wastelands, wooded areas, and bodies of water were also searched, but these efforts yielded no results. The defendant himself pleaded not guilty and refused to disclose what he had done with the body. Additionally, it was revealed that Anna had been feeling unhappy lately and had even considered divorcing her husband. She mentioned this several times during phone conversations with her mother and sister. The day before she disappeared, she called her mother, asking her to fly from Serbia for a few days. However, her mother apparently did not take her daughter's words seriously and decided to postpone her visit. The trial of Brian Walsh is ongoing. The accused is currently being held at the Norfolk Correctional Facility, awaiting his next court date. Anna's mother has been following the investigation from her home, as she has not traveled to the United States. The Serbian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has contacted the consulate in New York, which in turn has been in touch with the Norfolk District Attorney's Office to ensure that Anna's mother is timely informed about the investigation and hearings. As for the Walsh's 3 sons, they are now under state custody. None of Brian's family members wish to take care of them, citing Anna's mother's age and poor health, and her sister, who currently lives in Canada, also declined to take in her nephews. Only Anna's close friend, Pamela Barden, has expressed willingness to take the boys in, preferring that over them being separated and placed in different foster homes. Not a paradise. Our world is full of wonderful places to relax. To get away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, each of you has taken a break. For some, a trip to a lakeside with tents and barbecues is enough, while others prefer to spend their free time in more exotic ways, traveling to distant countries. Anticipating exciting adventures and discoveries, many look forward to their journeys. However, in unfamiliar territories, the carefree tourist may encounter unexpected troubles and even dangers. For some, such leisure could end fatally. Despite its obviousness, the story we are going to discuss is shocking in its impunity and leniency. It's hard to believe, but when confronted with a crime, law enforcement did not bother to work out the theories. The investigation was effectively conducted by the victim's parents, journalists, and a private detective. Gathering information about the disappearance of 18-year-old Natalie Holloway was a painstaking process. Today, together with you, we will try to understand where the young woman disappeared to, who was suspected in her disappearance, and whether it was possible to punish the potential criminal. Aruba, an island located in the southern Caribbean Sea near the shores of Venezuela. This small, self-governing entity is part of the Netherlands and mainly thrives on tourism. The main attractions here include diving, windsurfing, and underwater tours of the coral reefs. The local recreation areas are known for their sand, which does not burn the feet even in the hottest weather. The local inhabitants, pink flamingos, enjoy wandering near the water in full view of the amazed public. It truly is a paradise. Unsurprisingly, it attracted a group of young people, graduates from Mountain Brook High School. On May 26, 2005, 124 students accompanied by 7 chaperones traveled to the island to celebrate the start of their adult lives. Since all were already 18 years old, the chaperones only nominally maintained order and discipline. It was well understood that the students had come to relax and have fun. The future college students stayed in cozy rooms at the Holiday Inn. They had access to beaches, palm trees, restaurants, and local entertainment venues. They fully enjoyed themselves, swimming in the ocean, sunbathing on the beach, dancing until dawn. Naturally, the fun was accompanied by alcoholic beverages and gambling. Thus, the youth spent 5 unforgettable days in Aruba. On May 30th, the day of their return, the only one who did not arrive at the national airport was Natalie Holloway. In the first hours, everyone searched for her. Her belongings, as well as her phone and passport, were found in the hotel. However, she was nowhere to be found. Her mother, Elizabeth Twitty, was the first to raise the alarm. She called one of the chaperones and reported that she could not get in touch with her daughter. Later, the woman recalled that at that moment, her heart sensed something was wrong. Her daughter was obedient and always stayed in touch. Moreover, she was very punctual. Therefore, her delay was a bad sign. Natalie's mother and stepfather decided to fly to Aruba immediately to search for her. Upon arriving in Aruba, Elizabeth was able to find out much more information than the police did. The police seemed in no rush to start searching and ignored the worried mother's message. After all, cases like this are not rare, and authorities took it lightly. They stated that people often miss their planes or liners. Typically, they are found in a bar drinking Caribbean rum or in bed with a new acquaintance. Mrs. Twitty last heard that Natalie was seen on May 30th around 1:30 a.m. She left the bar accompanied by Joran van der Sloot. The pair got into a car where 2 other young men were present and drove away. After that, she was not seen again. During the vacation, her daughter's group often frequented the Carlos and Charlie's nightclub and the associated casino. Known for their bad reputation, these establishments were quite popular. It was there that Natalie met local regular, 17-year-old Joran, who offered her a drink. Afterwards, he invited her to see the lighthouse and the sharks living near it. She agreed. As they left the club, a silver Honda car with the Calpo brothers inside was waiting for them. 4 hours later, Elizabeth contacted the police again. This time, she had information that raised concerns. After that, the trio was detained. Initially, van der Sloot denied knowing Natalie, but later admitted he had indeed left the bar with her. According to him, they drove around for a bit, visited the beach, and later dropped her off near the hotel. The 18-year-old Deepak and 21-year-old Satish Kalpo confirmed their friend's account. It is worth noting, the young men were interrogated together, which seemed quite unprofessional from the law enforcement side. Later, their statements were repeatedly changed. Natalie was born on October 21, 1986, in Clinton, Mississippi. She was the eldest child of Elizabeth Ann and David Edward Holloway. Her father worked as an insurance agent, while her mother was a speech therapist. The parents loved each other dearly and had been together since their youth, but domestic life eventually took its toll on their marriage, and after 13 years, the couple divorced. Following the divorce, Natalie and her brother Matthew stayed with their mother. Despite this, Mr. Holloway did not lose contact with his family, supporting them emotionally and financially. In 2000, Elizabeth remarried to a businessman from Alabama named George Twitty, which brought Natalie to Mountain Brook. The move was smooth and painless. The children still saw their father frequently, visiting him during holidays. Natalie was very sociable, which made it easy for her to make new friends. Her family was quite devout, so they spent every Sunday in church. This deeply influenced Natalie's upbringing. Relatives remembered her as very kind and modest. She didn't attend parties or go on dates, even though she was quite popular. Her beauty was striking, and her smile radiant. At the same time, the young lady was an excellent student, engaged in dance, and participated in various clubs. She dreamed of pursuing a career in medicine and had chosen a local university where she hoped to receive a substantial scholarship. As can be seen, she had promising life prospects. At the time, she was especially excited about an upcoming trip. Although her parents were reluctant to let her go, she managed to persuade them. Unfortunately, what was meant to signify a new beginning for Natalie turned out to be the end of her life. Elizabeth maintained that her daughter was unlikely to trust a stranger, much less get into a car and go somewhere with him. It appeared that something had been slipped into her cocktail, clouding her judgment. Surveillance footage from the bar confirmed the mother's suspicions. On the night of May 29th to 30th, Natalie was sober enough. She was dancing and socializing, and her behavior was neither provocative nor compromising. However, after drinking a beverage offered by Joran, her gait and facial expression changed, suggesting she was indeed under the influence of some substance. The young woman's mother also spoke with the staff of Carlos and Charlie's. Employees spoke well of the young woman, which could not be said for van der Sloot. He was a person of interest. During his leisure time, he often behaved poorly, indulged in gambling, and consumed forbidden substances. At one of the hotels, he and his friends rented a room where they frequently invited foreign women. Everything that happened there, Duran secretly recorded on video and uploaded to the internet. Nonetheless, he was never held accountable for this. None of the charges against him ever went to court, and here's why. It turned out that Paulus van der Sloot, the young man's father, was a well-known lawyer aiming for a judgeship. Apparently, not only tourism, but also corruption thrived in Aruba. The outrageous incident caught the attention of not only the local community, but also American correspondents. Many news channels reported the incident, and some continued to monitor developments. Fearing a global scandal, the island authorities began extensive searches for the missing young woman. Alongside volunteers, divers and specially trained dogs were deployed. To expand the search area, the government even declared a public holiday for civil servants. Additionally, 50 Marines thoroughly combed the coastline. An airplane equipped with a thermal imaging camera scanned over 40 kilometers of terrain. The search for the young woman continued relentlessly, but Natalie seemed to have vanished. Soon after, David Holloway arrived in Aruba. He joined the investigation led by his ex-wife and journalists. Public pressure gradually increased. Moreover, it was discovered that the hotel's surveillance cameras did not capture the suspect's car on May 30th. There was no footage of the young woman entering the building, indicating that Duran and the Calpo brothers' statements were false. The police called them in for questioning again. This time, the younger van der Sloot unexpectedly remembered that he had dropped the young woman off not near the hotel, but a bit before reaching it, at a place without surveillance. He also added that he noticed a figure in black moving toward Natalie, apparently one of the Holiday Inn's security guards. On June 5th, the hotel security staff who were on duty that unfortunate night were detained. Investigators believed they might have intercepted the young woman along her way. On June 9th, detectives finally arrested the suspicious trio. Sharing a cell with the Calpo brothers, one of the security guards learned a crucial detail. Satish confessed to him that he and Deepak had lied to cover for their friend. In reality, they had left Duran alone with Natalie on the beach and had left themselves. The security guards were released home on June 13th. On June 17th, another suspect was detained, Steve Gregory Cruz, a DJ who handled music at yacht parties. Somehow, the police suspected his involvement in the young woman's disappearance. On June 22nd, Paulus van der Sloot was also brought in for questioning and was detained that same day. However, by June 26th, he was released along with Steve Cruz due to insufficient evidence. Days later, during another conversation, Duran offered a third explanation of the events. Learning that the Calpo brothers had told their version, he tried to shift the blame onto them. He reported that he had parted with Natalie near his home and she had left with the brothers. However, his story was not taken seriously. In defense of Satish and Deepak, a lawyer provided a rebuttal. As a result, on July 4th, after a brief trial, the Calpo brothers were released. Meanwhile, the custody period for Duran van der Sloot was extended by another 2 months. All leads pointed to him, yet the police seemed blind. Little is known about the young man. Duran van der Sloot was born on August 6, 1987, in Arnhem, Netherlands. His father, Paulus van der Sloot, was a lawyer, and his mother, Anita van der Sloot-Hoogen, was an art teacher. Duran was one of 3 brothers in a large family. In 1990, the family moved to the island. From childhood, the boy was a good student and even excelled at the International School of Aruba. As he grew up, he became interested in soccer and tennis, even achieving some success in sports. He planned to attend St. Leo University in Florida in the future. He was closer to his father during his childhood, while his mother considered him an incorrigible liar, which resulted in a strained relationship between them. Anita, being a creative spirit, valued true virtues in people and was very disappointed that she could not instill them in Duran. She also remembered that he grew up rebellious and often ran away from home. Over time, he fell in with a bad crowd and developed a penchant for gambling. However, he appeared differently in front of friends. He presented himself as cool and fearless. Even one of Natalie's friends mentioned that Duran made a good impression when they met. At first glance, he did not arouse suspicion, which is why Natalie was easily left alone with him. Locals were wary of the young man. They believed such permissiveness would not lead to anything good. Yet, he was popular with the girls, which he often took advantage of. Overall, the young man elicited mixed opinions from different people. While the investigation into the suspects was ongoing, the search for Natalie continued. U.S. authorities got involved. They couldn't directly conduct their own investigation, but closely monitored the progress and provided substantial financial support to help find the American citizen. The Aruban authorities were not fond of the scrutiny, but were willing to accept the funding. The Holloway family was desperate. In hopes of finding their daughter alive, they announced a monetary reward. Initially, the amount was $50,000. As hope dwindled, the reward increased to $1 million. Additionally, $100,000 was offered for information leading to the location of her remains, which later increased to $250,000. During this time, the investigation hit several dead ends. However, after the reward announcement, new witnesses emerged. One claimed to have seen Joran with the Calpo brothers at a local night spot between 2:30 and 3 a.m. Another witness claimed to have seen several suspicious men hiding a woman's body at a dump on the afternoon of May 30th. Yet, these statements led the investigation astray. After numerous checks, their claims were not corroborated. On August 26th, the police once again detained the Calpo brothers and another young man. However, these actions were unrelated to the case. The arrest of these young men was more about intimidation and an attempt to get them to talk. Ultimately, on September 3, 2005, all four were released on bail. A week and a half later, the court removed all restrictions and prohibitions, as none provided any substantial leads to the investigation. Overall, Joran van der Sloot spent about 3 months in custody. Once free, he reveled in the notoriety. Most would shy away from the heightened public interest, but Joran eagerly gave interviews and appeared on TV shows. According to his accounts, after meeting Natalie Holloway, she behaved flirtatiously. He claimed she offered intimacy, but he declined due to lack of contraception. On one show, the host asked, "Why should we believe you?" In response, Joran threw a glass at the interviewer, showcasing his impulsiveness and aggression to the world. It seemed very possible that Natalie could have been the victim of such an uncontrollable burst of anger. The journalist, who was the target of Joran's glass, harbored a grudge and did not forgive his rude behavior. With his help, a bug was placed in one of Joran's friend's cars. Eventually, intriguing information was obtained. The younger van der Sloot confessed to witnessing Natalie's death. He claimed they had indeed been intimate on the beach, but afterward, something happened to her. She started shaking and lost consciousness. He tried to revive her, even performed CPR, but sadly she passed away without regaining consciousness. Consequently, Joran and a friend took her body out to sea and disposed of it. It was a sensational confession, yet once again, he managed to evade the consequences. After the recording was played during an evening show, he quickly recalibrated. Joran contacted another show's organizers and issued a denial, explaining that he had only told his friend what he wanted to hear. In April 2007, van der Sloot released a book titled The Case of Natalie Holloway, My Own Account of Her Disappearance in Aruba, co-written with a Dutch journalist. In the 351-page book, he presented his perspective on the situation and apologized to the missing girl's family. In his narrative, he continued to assert his stance. By this time, the investigation and official search efforts had nearly ceased. In 2008, Aruban authorities announced 2 new witnesses in the case. The first witness reported seeing Joran and his father around 4 a.m. on May 30th, 2005, on the beach near the Holiday Inn. The younger van der Sloot appeared disheveled, shirtless, wearing wet pants and one shoe. According to the observer, the young man ran toward a snack bar, but just 10 minutes later, the father and son were seen arguing in a car before driving away together. The witness's statement was checked, and Paulus van der Sloot had an alibi for the night of Natalie's disappearance. The second piece of information came from Joran's former girlfriend. She recalled that he once offhandedly remarked, "Who knows? Maybe you're sitting next to someone you don't really know, someone who could easily dispose of another person's body." However, this was hardly a solid lead, as the young man was known for his lies and exaggerations. Amid these developments, Joran and the Calpo brothers were detained a few more times, but were eventually released after each questioning. Seeing no breakthrough in the investigation, the Holloway family hired a private investigator, Tim Miller, who, along with Natalie's father, interviewed local residents and searched the entire landfill. During this time, they discovered numerous oversights by the island's police, including failure to interview Natalie's classmates or even her hotel room neighbors. It was later discovered that someone used Natalie's electronic room key several times on the night of her disappearance. It was also unusual that she had left behind her mobile phone, a rare and expensive item back in 2005. A male DNA was found on her toothbrush after examining her personal belongings. Mr. Miller's involvement proved that the Aruban authorities had been negligent in their investigation. Paulus van der Sloot never achieved his ambition to become a judge. He succumbed to the immense shame and stress and died from a heart attack in February 2010. After burying his father, Joran took another appalling step. He contacted Mr. Holloway, offering to reveal the truth for a reward of $250,000. He framed his blackmail and extortion as a desire to help and ease his conscience. The family clung to this new opportunity. Subsequently, the family's lawyer, John Kelly, met with Joran in Aruba. To ensure the meeting, they paid him an advance of $25,000. When asked by the lawyer what would happen if they didn't pay, Joran responded, "You could wait another 5 years." After receiving the payment, van der Sloot provided a new version of events and showed the location of the remains. According to him, Natalie did not want intimacy and desperately resisted. Enraged, he pushed her hard. She lost her balance, fell, and her head struck a rock, causing her to lose consciousness. He then buried her body in a building foundation. Armed with this new information, Elizabeth Twitty contacted the police. Checking his claims was straightforward. The house Joran pointed to had long been built, and its foundation was fully set at the time of Natalie's disappearance. Consequently, the Aruban police stated that his testimony was not enough to warrant an arrest. Everyone concluded that this was just another lie from van der Sloot. After obtaining the money, the fraudster fled to Peru. However, the story does not end there. Unfortunately, the consequences did not catch up with him immediately. On June 1st, 2010, in a hotel room in Lima, Peru, the body of 21-year-old Stephanie Tatiana Flores Ramirez was discovered. She had been severely beaten, and the cause of her death was determined to be a neck fracture. The victim's father was a well-known businessman and a former Formula One racer, which led to significant media coverage of Stephanie's death. Surveillance cameras quickly helped identify the criminal. Soon after, he was arrested and taken to the police station. The perpetrator was none other than 22-year-old Joran van der Sloot. He explained that he had met the young woman at the Atlantic City Casino on May 30th. They spent some time playing poker and then decided to continue their acquaintance in his hotel room, where they played at an online casino. When Joran went to the bathroom, Stephanie accessed his laptop. There, she learned that her new acquaintance was suspected in the death of Natalie Holloway. Frightened and wanting to leave, Stephanie was stopped by Joran, who realized what had alarmed her. The event enraged him, and he struck Stephanie. He continued to attack her until he was certain she had died. Afterwards, he took a shower and left. Before departing, he asked the staff not to disturb his companion, claiming she was sleeping. Her body was discovered 3 days later. On June 3rd, van der Sloot was captured on his way to Chile. By the 4th day of his arrest, he confessed to the crime. The news shocked residents in the U.S., especially as it occurred exactly 5 years after Natalie's disappearance. Elizabeth Twitty expressed her grief, noting that justice had finally been served, albeit at the cost of another life. On January 11th, 2012, Joran van der Sloot was sentenced to 28 years in prison for the premeditated crime against Stephanie Flores Ramirez. He was also ordered to pay $75,000 in compensation to the Ramirez family. Initially, he was held at Piedras Gordas prison. In 2014, he was transferred to Chalapalca prison. During this time, Joran married a Peruvian woman whom he had met in 2010 when she visited another inmate. She claimed that her husband had changed significantly during their time together, being attentive and gentle on their dates. However, It appears she was sadly mistaken. Duran was using her for his own purposes and never showed any signs of remorse or guilt for his actions while incarcerated. In June 2011, David Holloway filed a petition in an Alabama court to have Natalie declared legally deceased. Natalie's mother stated that she would oppose this, still hoping that someday Duran would confess to the crime and face trial. The hearing was held twice. Judge Alan King stated that all legal requirements for declaring Natalie's death had been met, and on January 12, 2012, he issued a ruling in favor of the declaration. On June 8, 2023, Vandersloot was extradited to the United States and placed in Hoover City Jail in Alabama. The following day, he was charged with extortion and wire fraud, but he pleaded not guilty to all charges. On October 18, 2023, he entered a plea agreement, admitting to the murder of Natalie Holloway. He confessed that on the night of May 30, 2005, he fatally bludgeoned Natalie with a cinder block and then disposed of her body in the ocean to be consumed by sharks after she refused his advances. Unfortunately, the confession, made as part of the plea deal, could not be used in court. Ultimately, Vandersloot was sentenced to 20 years, which would run concurrently with his prison term in Peru. Natalie Holloway's disappearance remains one of the most notorious missing person cases in the U.S., and it is still an open case in Aruba. A series of cover-ups, corrupt deals, and bureaucratic delays effectively let the murder of an innocent young woman go unpunished, despite global attention to the investigation. Natalie Holloway became yet another victim of a sexual assault-based attack. Certainly one can debate the need for caution when meeting new people extensively, but this does not justify the criminal's actions or minimize them, nor should it allow a criminal to avoid punishment under any circumstances. The angry man walked out of the house, slamming the door hard. He reached the driveway and stopped. He ran his hand through his black, disheveled hair several times. The man was visibly nervous and said something quietly under his breath, then walked briskly back toward the house. He tugged sharply on the doorknob and stepped inside. Picking up a baseball bat that was lying at the entrance, he walked bossily through the house and shouted violently. At his screams, a blonde-haired young woman ran out. As soon as she approached him, he struck her on the head with the bat. The woman fell unconscious, and instantly a pool of blood formed on the floor around her. The enraged, dark-haired man continued to strike the immobilized woman until his fervor subsided. It is hard to imagine, but it happens that in such a paradisiacal place of the planet as New Zealand can happen such bloody tragedies. After all, New Zealand is first of all a picturesque nature with its unique flora and fauna, which creates a comfortable climate for people to live in. People living here have a high standard of living with a measured and calm way of life, where there is no corruption and crime is close to zero. But today our story will disrupt the tranquil life of Oakland and completely change the notion of a happy family. Carmen and Brad met on an ordinary day, which later became a fateful day for the two of them. Carmen Thomas was born on October 30th, 1987 in South Africa. Her father died when the girl was only 10 years old. Heavily bearing the loss, her family moved to relatives in the town of Whitby in the United Kingdom. But in another country, the long-awaited peace never came, and after a while her family moved back to South Africa. Carmen, who was over 18 years old at the time, decided to stay with her relatives and later moved to live in London. In London, Carmen completed her studies and earned a master's degree in marketing. She had a strong and mischievous personality that attracted people. Carmen was a loyal friend and comrade for many people, but a beautiful life in a large metropolis required a lot of expenses, and the girl had to work hard to ensure a decent standard of living. During the day, Carmen worked in the store as a marketer, and in her spare time she worked part-time in a gentleman's club. Despite her strange choice in the service industry, Carmen was a girl of strict rules and never allowed herself unnecessary and even more so undignified behavior, which was very much appreciated by important clients. It was there that she met an attractive and flamboyant man, Brad Callahan. Bradford James Joseph Callahan was born in New Zealand in April 1978. The boy's parents separated when he was 9 years old. Little Brad stayed with his mother, after which they moved to Australia. In 2001, Brad graduated from university and received an engineering degree in the construction industry. At the invitation of a large construction company, he moved to the UK, where he was offered a position as chief structural engineer for a large business complex. For important negotiations and added status, Brad turned to a gentleman's agency, and his choice fell on the beautiful Carmen. The man was intelligent, tall, black-haired, with bright dark eyes, but he could not afford a real relationship because of too much ambition and busy career. He had no free time for a permanent relationship. After a successful business dinner, Brad was conquered by the open and radiant Carmen. They continued informal communication, which was repeated again and again. After a while, they formed a good friendship, which later grew into love. The candy bouquet period flew by very quickly, and the lovers began to live together. Their life together was based on trust and care. They sincerely supported each other and looked absolutely happy. After a while, Carmen became pregnant, and Brad decided that the best solution for them would be to return to New Zealand, to a country with clean air and the measured course of life. They returned to Auckland. In March 2005, Carmen and Brad had their son Jack. Jack brought more joy and happiness into their lives. From the first days, Carmen and Brad took care of his safety and provided everything they needed for his happy childhood. To them, Jack was the most important thing in their lives. However, with the birth of their son, serious disagreements arose in their relationship. The first misunderstandings appeared because of the upbringing of the child. The relationship between the lovers became turbulent and unstable, and after 3 years they parted, but retained joint custody of the child. The breakup was difficult for both of them, but they sincerely tried to keep a good relationship for the sake of little Jack. Wanting support and wanting to be surrounded by family, Carmen and Jack moved in with Colin, Carmen's half-brother, who also lived in Oakland. Gradually, emotional balance returned to Carmen, and she began a new life without Brad. In 2008, Carmen moved with her young son to a house on a neighboring street to Brad's so that the son would be closer to his father. The young woman, who lost her father at an early age, sincerely wished that her child would always have a father around as much as she could. Despite this decision, many of Carmen's friends and family thought the couple still had a good friendship, but they only spent time together for Jack's interests. However, life went on. Carmen and Brad tried to find happiness separately again. Brad continued to work as a construction engineer, and in May 2009 he started a new relationship with a girl and even got engaged. Carmen was busy raising her son and resumed her services in the gentleman's club, which quite hurt Brad. He sincerely believed that the mother of his child should never again be interested in dubious earnings. This disagreement became a boiling point in their good relationship. With each passing day, the situation grew more heated. Carmen gave ultimatums to Brad, and he in turn simply ignored the requests of the former lover. Nevertheless, Brad entered into a new marriage and was preparing to become a father again. New financial obligations directly reflected on the alimony, which he paid under the agreement Carmen for the maintenance of Jack. The money was the last straw in a series of scandals. On March 19, 2010, neighbors called the police. The police officers arrived and responded to an incident of domestic violence. Carmen attacked Brad during another quarrel and received a warning. The relationship finally deteriorated. Arguments did not stop even at a distance. Each new question regarding Jack was perceived by each party in the bayonet and with aggression. Once loving parents for a long time could not agree on what school Jack should go to, and it again led to a number of unsolvable problems and a chain of scandals. On June 29, 2010, Brad again came to Carmen's house to make a new written agreement to pay child support and to discuss a new school for Jack. Carmen was not satisfied with the document, and she kicked Brad out of the house, yelling in the wake that Jack was not his son. Brad left. 2 weeks later, Brad tried to speak to Carmen again, but she did not make contact. On July 13, 2010, he reported Carmen Thomas missing to the police. The police took the report and began searching for the missing woman from video camera images and interviews with neighbors. Reconstructing the chronology of events since the last communication between Carmen and Brad, investigators found out some important details that should help in the search for the woman. They managed to find out that on June 29th, a surveillance camera recorded Carmen at a supermarket near her home. While inspecting the rented house where Carmen lived with Jack, the lack of a garbage can on the outside caught the attention of police. Inside the house, there were also traces of blood on the front door, on the washing machine, near the sink and shower. Forensic scientists used luminol to detect traces of blood left at the crime scene because it reacts with the iron contained in blood hemoglobin. The multiple patterns that appeared confirmed the presence of blood on the bathroom door and on the floor. The landlady told investigators that on June 29th, she heard loud screaming followed by prolonged crying and moaning. Recalling that day, she said she knocked on Carmen's door, but no one answered. She had to look out the window. She saw a street trash can and an overturned fabric horse, which is a drying rack usually made of wood or metal for drying clothes. Startled, the landlady called her husband, but while she waited for him to arrive, Brad walked out of Carmen's house and into the driveway. He was carrying soiled clothes in his hands, and upon seeing the landlady, Brad rushed to explain that Carmen had become ill after a medical procedure and had vomited blood. However, the landlady noticed Brad's condition. He looked like he had just taken a shower. The woman had no reason to disbelieve the man's story and did not call the police. The search continued, and Carmen's cell phone caught the attention of the police. Messages were being sent from her phone on a regular basis, but the manner of communication and tone of the messages were different and did not resemble Carmen's previous manner of communication. The outgoing messages and calls continued until July 10th. Where did the woman go if she needed medical help, and why? The investigators did not have to look for answers to these questions for long. During further investigation, Carmen's car was found. In the back seat of the car was found luggage, clothes, and other belongings of the woman. The examination of the seized suitcase on some of the things were found traces of blood. A note was also found in the car indicating that Carmen owed money to the agency where she worked. In the glove compartment was an envelope with Misty's name on it and the sum of $270. Police Inspector Mark Benefield, after finding traces of blood in Carmen's car, first raised the possibility that the woman had been murdered. Police searched the countryside southeast of downtown Auckland for the body of Carmen Thomas after a new report that her car was spotted around the time she went missing, but the search was inconclusive. The investigation and search for the woman continued. When investigators examined Carmen's and Brad's phones at the same time, they discovered both phones had been nearby the entire time they were being searched, and Carmen's phone was not connected to a cell tower in Hamilton. Going forward, one of the most important pieces of evidence was the missing trash can. It remained to be seen if it could be the same bin that had disappeared from its place near the house, and that a neighbor had seen through her window on the day Carmen disappeared. But what did the trash can need to be inside the house for? The police did not refute the idea of the worst possible outcome and rechecked Brad's cell phone and spending by examining his bank card details and traced his shopping list. On June 30th, Brad Callahan, a meat cleaver, and a large plastic container, as well as several garbage bags. By scrutinizing Brad's daily routine, police identified some exceptional events that did not fit into the young father's daily to-do list. It turned out that on one workday, Brad arrived at the construction site very early and walked alone around the property for a long time. It was strange, but not so strange that the workers who saw him would start reporting anyone about such an early presence of a supervisor at the construction site. Based on the evidence gathered, such as Carmen's cell phone and questionable purchases, Brad went from victim to suspect. Police believed that Brad Callahan killed his former lover by hitting her several times in the head and carefully hiding the body. On September 21st, Brad Callahan was arrested on charges of murdering Carmen Thomas and attempting to change the course of justice. He pleaded not guilty and is scheduled to stand trial. In a fateful coincidence, Brad's second son from a new lover was born at the time of his incarceration, which caused a wave of emotion and resentment in the young father who was in custody. The man broke down, and 9 days after his arrest, he pointed out to investigators the burial place of Carmen Thomas. Brad thought he had come up with the perfect plan, part of which was to make it appear that Carmen had gone to Hamilton and never returned. He was absolutely certain he had succeeded, but life made adjustments. Under questioning, he detailed the chain of events from that fateful day. After a bad conversation, Carmen kicked Brad out of the house, yelling in the wake that Jack was not his son. Brad left, but 5 minutes later, he came back into the house and hit Carmen in the head with a baseball bat with such force that she immediately fell unconscious. Blood spurted from her wound, staining the floor a bright red. Heavy breathing filled the room, and Brad stood over the body of his victim with a wild scowl in his eyes. He realized he had just done the irreparable, but he couldn't stop. In a fit of anger and resentment at Carmen's words, he threw several punches again. He knew that his act carried irreparable consequences, but everything remained in the shadow of his insane obsession. Memories flashed before Brad's eyes, happy and endless memories that were now gone forever. Brad knew that his life would be forever changed after that disastrous moment, and that he would not be able to get back everything that was, but it did not upset him at all, because by such an act he had solved his main problem, and Jack was now only his. Having come to his senses, Brad took a shower and then quietly left Carmen's house. In the days that followed, he sprang into action to get rid of Carmen's body and cover up the crime. Callahan called his friend and arranged to meet him outside the supermarket. He asked him to buy 3 black garbage bags, a bottle of kerosene and cleaning products, and waited for him outside the store, hoping to avoid suspicion. Brad then went back into the apartment and cleaned it up. He carefully wiped up the blood spatter and then wrapped the body in a bag and took it out in a trash can. In the following days, the defendant dismembered Carmen's body into 8 pieces to prepare it for disposal. He cut Carmen's legs from her torso at the hip joints. Each leg was cut through the knee into 2 pieces. Her arms and head were also severed from her torso. On July 3rd, he met a good friend at a boat ramp in Okahu Bay, near downtown Oakland. He told him that he had killed Carmen during an argument and needed help disposing of the body, but an attempt to dump the remains into the sea failed due to the friend's refusal to provide a boat. Over the next few days, he drove to Waitakere Ridge in West Auckland and buried the containers in a shallow grave. On July 7th, he drove Carmen's car to Hamilton and abandoned it in a hotel parking lot. He put a suitcase of clothes and several other bags of her personal belongings in the car to give the impression that the woman wanted to leave. But in his haste, he overlooked the fact that the suitcase also contained bloody clothes. After getting rid of the car, Brad began sending text messages from her cell phone to give the impression that Carmen was still alive. The criminal texted her friends, saying she wasn't feeling well and had been in bad shape for days. But Brad's perfect plan backfired on him. On October 1st, police went to the burial site Brad had indicated and discovered the body. Carmen Thomas's remains were found in plastic containers. They were carefully removed from a makeshift grave on Waitakere Ridge. An autopsy determined that Carmen Thomas had died from multiple blows to the head, with the fatal blow causing a compressed skull fracture. After multiple forensic examinations, Carmen's body was released to her family for burial. On October 13th, a private funeral was held at Green Lane Christian Center for Carmen Thomas, a young mother, a cheerful, kind, and successful woman. Little Jack,
who all along had waited and hoped to see and hug his mom, was only able to hug and kiss her white casket. On February 8, 2011, the first court hearing for Carmen Thomas took place. Judge Wenning found the crime committed was unintentional and took into account Brad's explanation that he acted on emotion. He acknowledged that it was done in a fit of rage, but Judge Wenning was less lenient when it came to the cover-up. On May 26, 2011, Brad Callahan was newly charged with attempting to change the course of justice. A summary of the police case shows that at 8:45 a.m. on July 29, 2010, Callahan struck Mrs. Thomas several times in the head, resulting in her death. He then texted a friend to bring 3 garbage bags and a bottle of kerosene. During the ensuing period, Callahan dismembered Miss Thomas's body into 8 pieces to prepare it for disposal. On November 25, 2011, a retrial was held. Police officers who had been working on the case filled the High Court in Auckland when Bradford Callahan unexpectedly made 2 guilty pleas. Brad Callahan, who had previously denied guilt, suddenly admitted to murder and attempting to change the course of justice after Carmen's death. The judge said it was one of the most serious cases of attempting to pervert the course of justice, calling Brad's actions just about the most serious case of attempted perversion of justice there can be. The judge also felt the murder of Carmen Thomas was brutal, but not so brutal as to result in the harshest sentencing laws. The 33-year-old man was sentenced in Auckland High Court, where a large public gallery was filled with Thomas's friends and family, including her parents, who were visiting from South Africa. Judge Wenning sentenced Brad Callahan to life imprisonment for murder and 6 years in prison for attempting to pervert the course of justice. He also condemned the lengths Callahan went to in order to cover his tracks. The sentences are to be served concurrently. Judge Wenning also said the minimum sentence for the perverting the course of justice charge was insufficient to bring Brad Callahan to justice. Mr. Callahan passed judgment on himself by his actions that day, and it had a devastating effect on 2 families, said Detective Inspector Mark Benefield. Callahan's supporters left court without comment. In a statement, the Thomas family said nothing can bring their Carmen back, and they are still angry because of it. But they are grateful that Brad will be away for an extended period of time so he can reflect on the enormous damage he caused to their own son in the first place. Carmen Thomas's mother, Teresa Scott, told the court in a victim impact statement that she felt completely destroyed by what happened to her daughter. After the verdict was announced, the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Inspector Mark Benefield, told the court that the justice done is the result of hundreds of hours of police work over the past 10 weeks since Carmen Thomas was reported missing on July 13, 2010. Also, Detective Mark Benefield, during the interview, explained what the work to find Carmen consisted of. He explained that early on in the missing person investigation, they determined that Carmen was most likely murdered. Then the work of gathering evidence, as well as researching information, was carefully conducted. This required a great deal of time and effort to gather, and it was also necessary that proper legal procedures were followed. The detective reported that over the last few weeks, close cooperation with the defendant's employer had not been finalized. Attempts to further investigate part of the Victoria Street construction site would continue in order to find any evidence that might assist the investigation. Until today, we have been unable to comment on media reports about our activities at the facility because we have been very sensitive to the issues of litigation and preemptive contempt of court, said Mark Benefield. He did not rule out the possibility of further arrests and charges in connection with Carmen's death in the near future. Brad Callahan had the courage to take responsibility for his actions in this tragic saga, and he pleaded guilty to 2 charges. But that will in no way change what he did. For the hearts of Carmen's loved ones are broken, their world shattered. Living each new day without Carmen, each of her close family members feels completely destroyed. We will never forgive him for what he did to our family, said Carmen Thomas's mother, Teresa Scott. I could forgive someone for taking a life under certain circumstances, But I can never forgive this man for being able to strip a body and hide it in containers, added her stepfather Wayne. Callahan's attorney Stuart Greaves said his client acted responsibly and does not intend to file a motion. Can a sentence with parole eligibility after 13 years and 8 months be called a ridiculous miscarriage of justice? Obviously, since New Zealand only records about 50 murders a year for the entire country, any crime that is a little out of the ordinary is covered extensively by the national media, as are the court cases for those crimes. It's possible that there was an overbearing bias against the victim at trial because of her line of work. But even if Carmen was antagonistic and pissed Brad off, we don't blame the victim for having her life taken from her, do we? If Brad had wanted sole custody of his son, he likely would have used this prejudice about Carmen's work and gotten his way because he had the opportunity. Instead, he beat her to death and tried to cover it up. In this situation, we are not diagnosing. We are only speculating. In summarizing this gruesome story, the same question comes up repeatedly. It is understandable that in a fit of rage and uncontrollable anger, a person can commit irreparable acts. But what feelings can a healthy person have when he comes up with a plan to dismember a once tenderly loved person? Little Jack Callahan is currently living in another town under an assumed name in the temporary care of his grandmother. He doesn't know that his daddy took his mom's life and must never find out because it wasn't his fault. Absurd. Sometimes exes come back. But the scary thing is not their return, but the fact that they may come back with weapons in their hands. On January 18, 2014, a young couple holding hands walked out of church. It was a bright day they had been looking forward to. The many people attending the service were still inside the church. The man and woman hurried to their parked car to grab boxes of toys and gifts for their young daughter, who was waiting for them at the church. But the subdued January silence was struck by loud pops. One, a second, a third. The young men fell like dolls whose batteries had died. Scarlet pools of blood filled the asphalt around them. A few minutes later, the emergency services received a call that 2 people had been killed in a parking lot near the church. People ran out at the noise. General outrage and shock grew in the roll call of the crowd. A little girl who had not received her presents cried from the panic that gripped her. She, like other parishioners, heard the sounds of gunshots, but did not see the full horror of what had happened. Police arrived at the scene and taped off the area and examined the scene of the attack. When emergency ambulance doctors arrived, they were left with only 2 deaths. The victims were young married couple Nathan and Crystal Maddox. We're going to start at the beginning together. We'll take a look at the lives of our heroes and go into detail about the situation they found themselves in, and also be sure to discuss whether such a tragic end could have been avoided. When lies, betrayal, greed, fear, and darkness become an integral part of someone's mindset, it causes them to commit horrible crimes that no one could ever imagine. In fact, an entire family can be drawn into such crimes, causing many worlds to fall apart. Our story features the brutal double murder of Nathan and Crystal Maddox. So now, if you are interested in learning all the minute details of this case, let's get started. The events of this family send us to Texas, the small town of Combsnale in Tyler County, a town so small that with a population of 563 people, people know each other by sight, and some of them have started families and become relatives. Nathan and Kristen's relationship was very fast-paced. Young people lived on neighboring streets, lived together the first love and the first kiss. The girl's parents did not approve of her choice, and in every possible way prevented their relationship. Kristen could not cross her beloved parents and refused her love. But fate presented a surprise, and Kristen learned that she was expecting a child. Parents had nothing left but to accept the situation and let the lovers get married, because it is unworthy to look in front of people as a single mother. Nathan and Kristen got married in Texas, and soon after the wedding they got a house and had their first child, a daughter, Madison. But family life turned out to be far from the fairy tale story from the movie. Nathan had to work hard to support his family. Having a house and maintaining it doesn't come cheap, so Nathan was forced to take a job away from home. He traveled to Montana. A young husband and father, he tried to visit Kristen and Madison as often as possible. He often sent money home to them, and for the most part, Nathan was pretty sure he had a happy family waiting for him at home. And that seemed to be the case. He loved Kristen, he loved Madison, he thought they had the perfect little family, until one day he came home from Montana. When he walked in the door, he noticed right away that the house was empty. Most of the things inside the house were gone, and there was a note on the kitchen table. In just a few lines, Kristen cruelly informed him that she was leaving Nathan. The reason seemed strange. The woman wrote that she didn't know where her husband was missing, who he was with, or when he would return. She wrote that she was unhappy, but that was a lie, because Kristen knew perfectly well that Nathan was in Montana for work. He called all the time, asking how she and her daughter were doing, what they were doing. He sent them money on a regular basis. The worst part of this episode was that she took Madison with her, and Nathan is now banned from seeing his daughter. Kristen did a very mean thing. She went to the police station and used false information to gain full custody of her daughter, indicating that her father was not providing for or interested in the child. Nathan knew that the ex-wife and daughter had returned to his parents' home. He repeatedly tried to see little Madison, but the Westfall family was adamant. They were jubilant that they had managed to get rid of an unloved son-in-law. Time passed. Nathan returned to his hometown to be closer to his daughter. He did not give up trying to see her, but he knew that it was necessary, with the help of a lawyer, to obtain official custody of his daughter and to achieve legal meetings. During this difficult period, he meets Crystal. They'd known each other since childhood. They went to school together. When they were teenagers, their paths diverged. Crystal went to the big city. She dreamed of graduating from university, but in her last year she got married, and instead of a successful career, she got a happy family life, in which 4 children were born. But unfortunately, after a while, the relationship between the spouses went downhill, and they decided to divorce. In 2011, Crystal and her children returned to her hometown. 2 longtime friends met each other at the most necessary moment for each of them. Nathan was enamored with Crystal's children. From the way their mother interacted with the children, from Crystal's inexhaustible energy that lit up everything around her, like a fairy with her optimism. In 2013, Nathan and Crystal were married. Nathan worked at the Lakin Industries warehouse, while Crystal started a small clothing business, opened a children's clothing boutique under her own name, and handmade jewelry. The family's business was doing very well, and it became feasible for them to hire a good lawyer to get a chance to see Nathan's daughter from her first marriage and try to get custody. Madison was thrilled with her daddy's new wife and the siblings she had. The girl was completely happy in her father's home. This made Lita and Paula Westfall, Kristen's parents, completely resentful. They were very afraid of losing their only granddaughter. Back in 2012, Kristen Westfall, with the support of her parents, applied to the court for full custody of her daughter. The custody battle dragged on for a long 2 years. The Westfall family had hoped to get full custody very quickly, but Crystal's arrival in Nathan's life changed the whole picture of his existence. A full family, a home, and a good job made a strong case in court, and Nathan was granted visitation rights with his daughter. He was very happy and prepared to take his daughter away for the day. In October 2013, the judge allowed Nathan and Crystal to have supervised visits with Madison. On January 18, 2014, Nathan and Crystal arrived at Mount Carmel Church for Sunday service, after which they wanted to go for a walk with 6-year-old Maddie. They left the church a little earlier than the rest of the congregation to retrieve pre-prepared gifts for Madison from their car. Just a few steps later, 3 loud pops were heard. Nathan and Crystal were killed by fatal gunshot wounds to the head. The small town was shocked by the gratuitous execution of a young married couple. But as it later turned out, there was a reason after all. But why take 2 people's lives, so brazenly and so brutally? The police arrived on the scene and meticulously investigated the scene. Nathan and Crystal had been shot in the head with a .30 caliber rifle, which was found at the scene along with .30 caliber shell casings. An autopsy later revealed that Nathan had also been shot in the thigh with a 20-gauge shotgun, leading investigators to assume that there were two shooters, as it is obvious that one person cannot shoot and reload at the same time. Investigators conducted a series of interviews with witnesses to gather information about the Maddox family and build their picture of what happened. They interviewed parishioners, acquaintances, and relatives of the slain family. But what surprised them most was the reaction of Nathan's ex-wife's family. Kristen and her parents were called to testify at the police station, as were the other witnesses. The further behavior of this family caused great surprise to the investigators. The Westfalls played up the tragedy too much, trying to hide their joy at the deaths that had occurred. Paul Westfall was so shocked that he went into a seizure, so much so that he couldn't believe the news of Nathan's death that he had to call emergency services. A grown man who had spent years trying to rid himself of Nathan's presence in his daughter's life was so upset that he had a seizure. Kristen was the first person interviewed, and her interview was a little creepy. She was the only one of the family to maintain a very calm and natural demeanor, despite the fact that she and Nathan had been together for a long time and had a child together. Kristen continued to give some really weird details about him, trying to bring out only the negative aspects of her ex-husband. She reported that she knew who killed him. In Montana, Nathan was listed in dangerous motorcycle gangs. One day, one of the gang members showed up at Nathan's mother's house and threatened to kill him. This story checked out, but it remained an empty threat because of an accidentally broken motorcycle, and the gang itself turned out to be a common exaggeration to confuse the investigation. Also, as an alibi, Kristen said that on the day of the crime, she was at the grocery store with her father Paul, a couple miles from the church, after which they both went home. Surveillance footage at 10:57 a.m. confirmed their presence at the grocery store. Paul Westfall told the exact same story, but Paul was a hunter and had a firearm in his arsenal, so his hands were tested for traces of gunpowder, but the result was negative. But until now, his reaction to the death of Nathan, whom he sincerely hated and never hid it, seemed to the investigators very strange and played. It left a sliver of doubt in his sincerity. Interviews with loved ones, over a short period of time, helped investigators discover that Nathan Maddox was involved in a custody battle over his daughter with his ex-wife, Kristen Westfall, and her family. After a long and bitter dispute in court, he was close to retaining custody, something that none of the Westfall family members strongly wanted. Such a desperate battle between the parties may well have been cause for reprisal. But the police had no concrete evidence to arrest any member of the Westfall family. The family consisted of 4 people, and 2 people were the shooters. Investigators had yet to be convinced of their story and figure out which family member pulled the trigger, taking the lives of 2 people, or whether a hired killer did it. The investigators took a different path and decided to act through the main protagonist of the controversy, little Madison Maddox. After all, her safety was at stake. She continued to be with a family that could pose a threat to her. Police officers, along with Child Protective Services, CPS, came to remove the girl from the home, but faced a wave of protest and rage. The behavior of the older Westfall family entailed a search of the home. What the police later found in the house shocked them. A gun was stored on a shelf in an easily accessible place in the room. The culmination of the search was the illegal drugs scattered around the house. It turns out that in 2013, Kristen Westfall was charged and arrested for possession of a controlled substance. The arrests were repeated, which clearly indicated that Kristen couldn't be a good mother to Madison. When Kristen went to jail in early 2013, her parents were granted temporary custody of their daughter and would not allow Nathan to see her while their granddaughter was in their custody. However, despite Child Protective Services prohibitions, Kristen continued to live in the house with her young daughter in the same room and slept in the same bed with her. Even in 2014, with the injunctions in place, Kristen continued to live with the rest of her family and had daily access to her daughter, despite being ordered by the court to move. After a search of the Westfalls' home, where a used syringe with residue of illegal substances was found on a dresser and a gun on the nightstand next to Kristen's bed, little Madison was taken into temporary custody, and additional evidence found led to the Westfalls' arrest. State authorities wanted the girl placed in foster care and said they found supplies for illegal drugs in the Westfalls' home, as well as a gun on a nightstand within easy reach of the girl. Child Protective Services was involved in the Madison Maddox custody case. In March 2014, less than 2 months after the tragic murder outside the church, authorities made 4 arrests. Kristen Westfall, 29, her younger brother Cameron, and her parents Paul and Lita Westfall were arrested. There was no direct evidence of their guilt in the Maddox murder. Cross-examinations didn't produce the desired result either. So the police had to go for a little trickery to put the squeeze on the most vulnerable member of the Westfall family. That was 18-year-old Cameron. He was told that if proven guilty, all members of his family would face life imprisonment, and the direct killers would face the death penalty. Cameron was young and kind-hearted. He was very scared and quickly agreed to cooperate with the investigation, revealing all the details of what happened. The crime against the young couple, Maddox, turned out to be carefully pre-planned by the family gang in order to permanently exclude Nathan from the role of father. Shortly after the shooting episode, it was revealed that Nathan and his ex-wife Kristen, with the help of her family, had been secured a nasty custody disagreement over their 5-year-old daughter Madison. The long and costly legal battle was to end well for Nathan. The Westfalls were concerned and carefully plotted a scheme to remove him from Madison's life. Nathan wanted to take care of his daughter alone, but the Westfalls were not interested in letting her go even to see her father, let alone give him the girl permanently. The Westfalls were very hurt by the fact that the former son-in-law had settled down in life and was living a good life. Thus, when the judge allowed him multiple visitations, it became obvious that he could win the trial, which led to Kristen coming up with an original idea to get rid of him once and for all. At first, Kristen tried to find someone to kill her ex-husband. When that failed, she and her father decided to do it themselves. On Sunday afternoon, the family often attended church, and the day of January 18th was no exception. Lita Westfall and little Madison drove to the appointed time for the service. Afterward, she had to hand the girl over to her father. In the meantime, Kristen and Paul went to a distant store and posed as customers to get on CCTV cameras to create a solid alibi. But they miscalculated the timing. Each family member had their own responsible role to play. For the entire interval, they communicated by text message, updating each other on the Maddox's movements. Letha, who had attended the service, informed Paul as Nathan and Crystal prepared to leave the church. She also called 911 immediately after the murder. Cameron took an active role in concealing the evidence. He discarded the gun used after his sister and father shot the newlyweds in the head near a remote church. He drove to a lake where he discarded the bag of weapons. Cameron soon agreed to cooperate with authorities and revealed that Kristen originally came up with the idea and the family went along. He also pointed out to investigators the location where he had discarded the murder weapons. Divers later retrieved said items, which confirmed Cameron's words. The police detained 29-year-old Kristen, her brother Cameron and her parents, Paul and Letha Westfall, and charged them with organized crime. Thus, Kristen and Paul pulled the trigger, with Cameron and Lita acting as willing accomplices. Given that Lita was at the church at the time of the incident, it was obvious that she was not responsible for the shots that killed Nathan and Crystal Maddox. However, phone records showed that she was responsible for informing her daughter and spouse of the couple's whereabouts, and that she informed them as they left the church. While Kristen and Paul were the ones who fired the bullets, Lita and her son Cameron participated in the crime intentionally. The trial was very loud and lengthy. Each member of the Westfall family was tried separately. Paul Westfall continued to act out his seizures, so he was found mentally unfit and remained in a state psychiatric hospital for a while for evaluation. In May 2014, a judge found Paul incompetent, but that verdict was overturned 4 months later. With Paul and Letha facing the death penalty for the murders of Nathan and Crystal Maddox, they had little choice but to agree to a mutually beneficial plea bargain with the DA's office. To avoid the death penalty, Paul was forced to take a plea bargain with the prosecution. He pleaded guilty to the charges and thus was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lita also took a plea bargain with the investigation. Instead of going to trial, she pleaded guilty to participating in organized criminal activity. Lita will not be eligible for parole until 2046. She is currently incarcerated at Mountain View Prison in Gatesville, but will be eligible for parole in 2044. At the time of sentencing, Lita Westfall was 54 years old, so she will likely die in prison. Kristen is the third member of the Westfall family to stand trial in this case. Throughout the entire court hearing, Kristen pleaded not guilty. To all the accusations against her, she replied that her whole family was crazy. She was the only one who was sincere about it. When her entire family, Letha, Paul, and Cameron, came to the trial and testified against her, she couldn't say anything to their faces. In August 2016, the final trial and sentencing for Kristen Westfall began. The motive for killing Nathan and Crystal Maddox was custody of Madison Maddox. Kristen adamantly did not want Nathan to see Maddie whenever he wanted. She did not want to give him the privilege because she could not see him happy. She wanted to control her daughter and father's communication herself, and through the child, she wanted to control everything he did and everything he felt. The trial took over a week. In the end, with overwhelming evidence against her, it took the jury 8 hours to find her guilty of capital murder. In a Brazos County courtroom, attorneys and the judge considered final motions for the woman. Kristen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole nearly 9 months before her father pleaded guilty and received an identical sentence in May 2017. Kristen Westfall is currently incarcerated at the William Hobby Women's Prison in Falls County, Texas. While Paul, Lita, and Kristen Westfall were ultimately charged with 2 counts of murder, officials only charged the youngest member of the family, Cameron, with 2 counts of tampering with or fabricating physical evidence. Cameron Westfall pleaded guilty to 2 counts of third-degree tampering with evidence. The judge deferred sentencing contingent upon Cameron Westfall testifying against his family. He faced up to 10 years in prison on each charge. It was reported that he had nothing to do with the actual shooting, and that his mother was also not involved because she was at the church when the crime occurred. However, phone records show that she texted her husband and daughter as the Maddoxes were preparing to go home. Currently, Cameron is incarcerated at the Huntsville Correctional Facility in Huntsville, Texas, where he is expected to remain until his expected release date in 2025. Cameron was very indifferent to the crime, and he really had nothing to do with the crime, as he claims Paul allegedly just happened to come home, handed Cameron 2 guns and told him to throw them away. But the investigation didn't rule out that Cameron knew a little more than he was saying. After all, Cameron lived in the house with his family, and he simply couldn't have not heard about Kristen and Paul's plans to kill the Maddox family. And if he was an unspoken witness to the plot, after all, why didn't he go to the police or even try to stop his family? So ended the story of a double murder at the House of Dodd in a close-knit community that shook the entire state of Texas to its core. Recall that on January 18, 2014, Nathan and Crystal Maddox were shot and killed right outside the gates of Mount Carmel Baptist Church near Colmsnew. After waiting for a legal and supervised visitation with his 5-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, it soon became clear that the girl's biological mother, Kristen Westfall, and her entire family, brother Cameron and parents Lloyd Paul and Lita Westfall, were behind the crime. This case was complicated. The community demanded justice. Lloyd Paul, Lita, and Cameron Westfall made a deal with the investigation. After agreeing to testify against his sister, Cameron took a plea bargain. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, 2 counts of tampering with or fabricating physical evidence. In 2016, a judge sentenced Cameron to 10 years in prison, and his mother received a life sentence. The following year, a judge sentenced Lloyd Paul to life in prison. He avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to first-degree murder. Under the plea agreement, he would not be able to appeal the sentence. The crime family's protagonist, Kristen Westphal, received a life sentence without parole. In a fateful decision by her mother, Madison Maddox lost her father and will likely never see the grandparents who cared for her and perhaps even loved her. Time after the Westphal family was sentenced, the legal battle for custody of Madison Maddox continues. Nathan Maddox's father, Jim, has since filed a petition to become the primary guardian of his granddaughter. A huge number of people die in custody battles every year. Most importantly, the children are not made happier, but orphans with psychological problems. All the people in the town were devout, went to church, and they're also easily killed people. Covering themselves with concern for the girl, the older generation of Westphal fulfilled the wish of their daughter and helped to commit this terrible crime. What were they hoping for? Based on the story, Nathan was not a bad or mean person. He loved his own daughter and strove to be a good father to her. Obviously, in addition to the custody battle, the hatred associated with the fact that the girl's father had created a new family, was able to pick up his mind, and started a new life without crime comes first, and was perfectly happy with the new woman, having something he didn't have in his past relationship with Kristen. That's what was causing all the negativity from the ex-wife, and she was able to turn her entire family against him. If it was just about custody, they wouldn't have killed Nathan's new woman, and that's probably true. After all, the Madison custody dispute started before Nathan and Crystal's relationship. There is certainly only one loser in the history of the Westphal versus Maddox fight. Of course, it's Madison. I'd like to believe that when she grows up, she won't remember the wild selfishness with which adults tried to take advantage of her by saying words about love. After all, if the family had loved the child, they would have tried to build a normal relationship for her sake. But they were only acting to please their own egos. The case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, doomsday spouses. Crimes motivated by religious beliefs are not uncommon in criminal practice. Statistics show that every year, worldwide, over 100,000 people fall victim to religious fanatics. Often these victims do not share the fanatics' orthodox views. The case of the deranged duo, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, shook the world a few years ago and remains unresolved to this day. This story has been covered in media outlets across various countries, shocking and baffling people. It's a tale entwined with corrupt passion, belief in one's own exceptionalism, greed, and a complete lack of moral principles. 5 members of their own families, including 2 children, fell victim to this couple. Currently, the legal proceedings against the spouses from hell, as the press has dubbed them, are still ongoing. They face capital punishment for their heinous acts. However, they not only deny their guilt, but also seriously hope to escape punishment or receive minimal sentences. But let's start from the beginning and try to unravel this horrifying and complex story, an attempt to understand how people who claim to have found God completely lost their humanity. Who is Chad Daybell, and how did he become a leader of a religious movement? Chad Guy Daybell was born on August 11, 1968, in the small town of Provo, Utah, located 18 miles south of Salt Lake City. He grew up in a simple, even humble family, and was a quiet, shy child. Chad was an average student in school, without any notable talents or athletic achievements, and he was self-conscious about his weight. After finishing high school, Chad, not without difficulty, enrolled at Brigham Young University, BYU, in Utah, graduating in 1992 with a bachelor's degree in journalism. During his college years, he married a modest girl named Tamara, or simply Tammy Douglas. The couple quickly had 5 children, sons Seth, Mark, and Garth, and daughters Emma and Leah. After completing his studies, the young father worked as an editor at a local daily newspaper. However, due to the family's constant financial struggles, he also worked as a night watchman at a small church and as a gravedigger at the cemetery next to it. Since Tammy did not work outside the home and focused solely on household chores and raising their children, the family barely made ends meet. At one point, Chad decided to use his journalism education to write his own religious-themed book. His first work was published in 1999 and resembled a collection of religious stories or religious-themed fantasy. Surprisingly, the book became a hit, earning him a decent amount of money. Chad immediately quit his jobs at the cemetery and the newspaper to focus on his writing career. About a year and a half later, he published a book titled 1 Foot in the Grave. This was a popular science work in which he described his experiences as a gravedigger, pondered death, the afterlife, and soul reincarnations. In 2004, Daybell founded his own book company, Spring Creek, which he used to self-publish his works. These works discussed his beliefs about the impending end of the world, Judgment Day, and more. Some say that over the years, Chad's religious beliefs became more extreme. Chad Daybell published dozens of fiction and popular science books infused with religious themes. He began to conduct podcasts, audio, and video lectures aimed at helping people prepare for the second coming of Christ. Chad called himself an apocalyptic writer and claimed he could see the future, hearing voices of the deceased giving prophecies meant only for him. The Story of Lori Vallow, Biography, Early Marriages, Children. Lori Ryan Vallow, née Cox, was born on June 26, 1973, in the picturesque city of Loma Linda, California. She grew up in a large family, alongside 2 older brothers and 3 sisters. Her parents, Denise and Barry Cox, worked tirelessly to provide for their many children. From an early age, Lori was particularly close to her brother Alex, with whom she shared a trusting relationship.
He always stood up for his little sister and protected her. Even in her school years, Lori became a true beauty, with no shortage of admirers. An attractive, charismatic blonde with a slender figure and a captivating smile, she loved being the center of attention, and was a spirited and adventurous person. In the spring of 1992, at the age of 18, Lori married her high school sweetheart Nelson Yanes, with whom she had started a relationship in her senior year. However, the young couple soon realized they had rushed into marriage and were not ready for family life, leading to the dissolution of their marriage in less than a year. They did not have any children together. In the fall of 1995, Lori remarried, this time to a man named William LaJoya. A year later, the couple had a son, Colby, but their marriage ended in 1998, just 2 years later. The boy remained in his mother's custody. In early 2001, Lori entered into her third marriage with Joseph Anthony Ryan, who officially adopted her son from her previous marriage. A year later, the couple welcomed a daughter, Tylee, but this marriage too collapsed in 2005. Notably, soon after her divorce from Joseph, an incident occurred when her ex-husband came to visit the children. He was assaulted by Lori's brother Alex, who claimed in court that he was defending his sister's honor, as Ryan had insulted her. As a result, Cox was sentenced to a fine and a short prison term. Marriage to Charles Vallow. Soon after divorcing her third husband, Lori met a man named Charles Anthony Vallow, whom she married in February 2006. He was 17 years her senior, but this significant age difference did not pose an obstacle for them. Charles had been previously married and had 2 teenage sons from his past relationships, Zachary and Nicholas. The couple initially lived in Nevada with Lori's children from her previous marriages, while Charles's sons visited during holidays or weekends. Charles owned a small business that provided a stable income to support the family. Lori, who had not pursued further education, did not work, but her husband never reproached her for it. In 2014, the couple officially adopted a young boy named Joshua Jackson, or simply JJ Vallow, who was Charles's grandnephew. JJ had autism and required expensive therapy, which his relative could provide. Towards the end of 2014, the family decided to move to the Hawaiian Islands, specifically to the island of Kauai. By this time, Colby, as well as Charles's older children, were adults living independently, so the Vallow family moved to the island as a group of 4, Lori, Charles, Tylee, and JJ. The family settled in a popular tourist area, deciding to open their own beach bar specializing in fresh juices, smoothies, refreshing drinks, and non-alcoholic cocktails. Despite all their efforts, the availability of raw materials, and Charles's experience in trade, the business quickly failed due to intense competition. Around this time, Lori became interested in religious literature and was particularly drawn to a series of books titled Standing in Holy Places by the aforementioned Chad Daybell. She became so captivated by the occult writer's views and thoughts that she became almost obsessed with his ideas. She purchased all his works and read them daily. The meeting of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. In 2016, the family was forced to leave Hawaii and return to the mainland. They settled in Arizona, and while Charles worked hard to provide for the family, his wife Lori increasingly immersed herself in religion, drifting away from reality. In October 2018, Lori and her close friend Melanie attended an event in a neighboring town called Preparing People for the Second Coming of Christ, led by Chad Daybell. As a devoted fan and follower, Lori was thrilled at the opportunity to meet him in person. Lori sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on Chad. He also noticed the attractive blonde, and after the event, when the writer and religious speaker decided to personally engage with his followers, Lori, as expected, stayed behind.
She hung on his every word and asked if she could touch his hand. After doing so, Daybell looked into her eyes and said that they had been husband and wife in 7 previous reincarnations. Chad and Lori exchanged contact information and began communicating daily. A few weeks later, when Lori's husband went to Nevada for work, she invited the preacher to hold a gathering at her home. That day, about a dozen people gathered at the Vallow house, discussing God, the Judgment Day, and the Second Coming. Lori and Chad also agreed to collaborate on preparing people for the dreadful judgment. The pair started conducting podcasts dedicated to this event, leading sermons and writing articles. Lori became increasingly detached from reality and her family, but Charles, unfortunately, did not immediately notice this change. He thought it was a temporary obsession and would soon wear off. By the time he realized how far things had gone, it was already too late. Soon, Lori began talking about dark spirits and zombies, telling family and friends that she was chosen by God for a special mission. Part of this mission involved destroying the spirits of darkness, demons, and all evil. Charles's attempt to bring his wife back to reality failed, and more so, she began to see him as one of the dark entities that needed to be destroyed. The tragic end of Charles Vallow. By the end of 2018, the marriage between Lori and Charles Vallow was on the brink of collapse. In February 2019, during Charles's week-long business trip, Lori changed all the locks in their shared home. Upon his return, Charles found himself locked out of his own house, noticed his personal car, the family truck missing, and discovered that a substantial amount of $35,000 had been withdrawn from his account. Charles loudly called out for his wife and tried to enter the house. Lori, in a frenzied state, rushed outside, hurling threats and curses. She screamed that her husband's soul had long died, his body possessed by a demon, repeatedly exclaiming, "I don't know who you are and what you've done with my husband." Without hesitation, Charles went to the police station and reported Lori for theft, obstruction to his home and children. He expressed concerns about her threats of physical harm against him, leading to the issuance of a protective order prohibiting Lori from approaching him. The statements Charles made that evening were recorded, a standard procedure. He spoke about his wife's excessive religious fervor, her belief in an imminent end of the world, and her tendency to classify people as either light or demonic beings. The officers, while asking clarifying questions, openly mocked him, but still issued the protective order. The very next day, Charles filed for divorce and changed the beneficiary of his $1 million life insurance policy from Lori to his mother and sister. His lawyers stated that Charles was concerned about the well-being of JJ, who required special care. He knew his mother and sister would responsibly manage the insurance payout and take care of the boy in case anything happened to him. As for Tylee, her stepfather had not legally adopted her and couldn't include the legally unrelated minor in the documents. A few months later, Mr. Vallow made the fateful mistake of revoking the protective order, hoping to reconcile with Lori and save their marriage. He began visiting his ex-wife's home, missing the children, and still hopeful of family reconciliation. On July 11, 2019, Charles was fatally shot twice in the chest when he arrived to see his children. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, called emergency services and confessed to the shooting. He claimed self-defense, alleging that Charles attacked him first with a baseball bat. In response, he drew a pistol and fired twice without aiming. The incident was witnessed by the homeowner and children. Their testimonies were somewhat consistent, and the court ruled the incident as an unintentional killing in self-defense. Notably, Alex's head injury was minor, despite Charles's background as a former baseball player capable of inflicting severe harm with a bat. The same day Charles's body was taken to the morgue, Lori threw a party at the house with music, numerous guests, and a poolside disco, right where her husband had been shot and where traces of blood were still visible. She didn't arrange for his funeral or inform anyone about the incident. Charles's sons, mother, sister, and other relatives only learned about his death a week later, when his unclaimed body was still in the morgue. A series of mysterious disappearances and fatalities. Shortly after her husband's demise, Lori sold their Arizona home and, along with her children, relocated to a town called Rexburg in Idaho, settling close to where Chad and his wife Tammy lived. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, moved with his sister and settled in the same housing complex. Lori enrolled her son in a school for children with special needs, but her 16-year-old daughter, Tylee, did not attend any educational institution. She was seldom seen outside, leading many neighbors to remain unaware of the second child's existence. Around the same time, Lori referred to her daughter as a dark entity in a phone conversation with a friend. On September 8, 2019, the children, their mother, and Uncle Alex went to Yellowstone Park, where Chad Daybell joined them. Several photographs from that trip showed Tylee, but after that day, she was never seen alive again. On September 24th of the same year, Lori withdrew her son's documents from the school, claiming he would henceforth be homeschooled. The 7-year-old boy was also not seen afterward. Less than a month later, on October 19th, Chad's 49-year-old wife, Tammy, passed away suddenly. According to Chad, she had a cold with a cough and presumably died from respiratory failure in her sleep. With no signs of violence on her body, her death was ruled natural. Chad categorically refused an autopsy to definitively determine the cause, a decision that oddly raised no suspicions. Following his wife's sudden passing, Chad received approximately $500,000 in insurance payouts. 2 weeks later, Chad and Lori traveled to the Hawaiian Islands, where they officially married in a beachside ceremony. This event came as a total shock and surprise to Daybell's children, who were still mourning their mother and couldn't comprehend their father's actions. Upon returning to Arizona, the couple lived together and misled others by claiming Lori's children were with relatives, or even asserting she had no children at all. They also rented a small unit at a local storage facility, where they later moved all the belongings of the children as if they never existed in the home. Another month later, on December 12, 2019, Alex Cox died suddenly in his home. The cause of death appeared to be a heart attack, but at his sister's insistence, no autopsy was conducted, and the incident was deemed natural. Investigation, arrest, and horrific discoveries. As time passed, more people persistently questioned Lori about the whereabouts of her children. She skillfully lied to neighbors and acquaintances, but it was more complicated with relatives. Her eldest son, Colby, who had little contact with his mother after moving away, tried earnestly to reach his younger sister. Initially, Lori answered from her daughter's phone, pretending to be Tylee, but Colby soon sensed something was amiss. Meanwhile, Charles's relatives demanded access to JJ. They wanted to take the boy for holidays or weekends or simply talk to him on the phone, but Lori consistently refused or made up absurd excuses. Eventually, the boy's grandmother reported his disappearance to the police, and soon after, Colby also approached the police to find his younger sister. When law enforcement officers knocked on Lori's door and asked her to bring the children for a conversation, she lied that they were visiting relatives. This information proved false, and the police returned to her home. They gave her a week to appear at the police station with the children, but instead, she and her husband fled to Hawaii again. On February 20th, 2020, Lori was arrested on the island of Kauai and taken back to Arizona. A search was conducted in her and Chad's home, but neither the children nor any signs that they had been there were found. Now her husband Chad, who had been defending her and insisting she had no children, was also under suspicion. It was only on June 9th that police discovered human remains buried in the backyard of the couple's home. Forensic analysis revealed that they were the bodies of the missing Tylee and her younger brother JJ. Chad was immediately detained for concealing evidence and complicity. The authorities then decided to exhume the bodies of Tammy Daybell and Alex Cox to establish the true causes of their deaths. In both cases, traces of chemicals capable of inducing heart failure were found, leading to the conclusion that these individuals did not die naturally. The trial process. The trial of the spouses commenced in January 2021. They faced charges of conspiring to commit first-degree criminal acts, grand theft through deceit, and insurance fraud. Moreover, the demise of Charles Vallow was reclassified from self-defense to premeditated criminal action. Witnesses testifying in court stated that Lori referred to her children as dark entities and promised to save their souls. There were speculations that the deaths of 16-year-old Tylee and 7-year-old JJ might have had ritualistic elements. Notably, the adolescent girl's body was partially burned. Weeks before, Chad had sent Lori an email rating people, where he assigned Tylee a 2 as a dark spirit. Given the totality of the charges, both spouses faced the possibility of capital punishment. However, in May 2021, Vallow's defense team succeeded in having her declared incompetent, halting the trial process. Simultaneously, all 5 of Daybell's adult children insist on their father's innocence, believing he was framed by Lori and Alex. In 2022, after treatment in a psychiatric facility, Vallow was again deemed fit to stand trial and answer for her actions. In March 2023, the judge ruled out capital punishment as a sentence for the woman, a decision the prosecution is still attempting to contest. In July of the same year, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial against Chad continues, and he still faces the prospect of capital punishment. It is worth noting that this story inspired the book When the Moon Turns to Blood by investigative journalist Lily Sotail, as well as a 2021 television movie by Lifetime Movie Network titled Doomsday Mom: The Lori Vallow Story, starring Lauren Lee Smith. In addition, Netflix released a 3-part documentary series in 2022 called Sins of Our Mother, which includes an episode dedicated to Lori's eldest child, her son Colby.
The Rachel O'Reilly case, one of Ireland's most violent crimes. When a person disappears without a trace or dies in mysterious circumstances, usually the other half is among the main suspects. Unfortunately, in about 80% of cases, suspicions are justified. In such crimes, there is usually not even a clear motive, and the crime itself has been defined as domestic, as if it were something ordinary. In the early 2000s, the high-profile case of Rachel O'Reilly literally shocked the whole of Ireland with its unprecedented cruelty and cold-bloodedness. A young woman and mother of 2 young children was brutally murdered in her own home, and police officers who arrived on the scene admitted that they had never in their practice encountered such a horrific crime scene. To solve this mystery and put all the pieces of the puzzle together, it took investigators several years of painstaking work. All this time, the criminal remained at large and was sure that his guilt no one and never prove. Perhaps it would have happened, but the killer was let down by his own vanity. Well, let's take the whole story from the beginning. Who was Rachel O'Reilly? Rachel O'Reilly, maiden name Callally, was born in 1974 on the northern outskirts of County Dublin, Ireland. His biological parents' girl did not know. At an early age, she was adopted by spouses Rose and Jim Callally, and she was brought up with 4 other adopted children of the couple. Their own heirs, Rose and Jim, could not have, so all their parental love without a trace gave foster children. From a small age, Rachel was an active and purposeful child. She studied well in school, played sports, helped her parents in the household, and never caused any problems. The girl grew up sociable, open, and incredibly kind. She easily got along with everyone and avoided any conflicts. As a teenager, Rachel was seriously engaged in softball, constantly took part in various competitions, and even set several local records. She also had a very strong bond with her foster mother, to whom she confided all her secrets and with whom she communicated constantly, even after she married and had children of her own. After graduating from high school, the girl enrolled in one of the local universities, deciding to get a degree in marketing. At the same time, she got a job as a salesperson in a city department store, and in her spare time, she continued to play sports, playing for the local team. Who is Joe O'Reilly? In fact, there is not much information about Joe O'Reilly's early life in public sources. He was famous for his inhumanity and extreme cruelty to his own spouse and the mother of his 2 children. But what kind of person he was as a young man is hardly ever talked about or remembered. It is known that Joe is also a native of County Dublin, where he was born in 1972 in a simple family. He was the second common child of his parents and was raised with his older sister. The children of the O'Reilly couple were not spoiled, and parents taught them that in life, everything should be achieved independently by their own efforts and hard work. The boy was quite tall, athletic, and was also fond of softball. After graduating from high school, he decided to study advertising by correspondence, and to earn a living, he got a job as a manager in a department store, the same department store where Rachel came a few months later. At the time of their first meeting, Joe was 19 years old, and Rachel was barely 17. The young man immediately noticed the new employee and took the initiative to be the first to meet her. Miniature smiling blonde, literally dizzy the guy's head, but only to go on a date with him. She, for some reason, categorically refused. Joe began to woo Rachel, said compliments, made little surprises in the form of flowers or chocolates at her workplace at the beginning of the day, but Rachel still remained cold to him. Desperate attempts to get the attention of the young saleswoman, with interest, watched almost the entire staff of the department store, and it even became a reason for jokes. However, Joe did not give up. He read Rachel's favorite book, so that they have a common topic for conversation. But it was only when Joe found out that Rachel was a serious softball player that things got off the ground.
That's when he joined her at the stadium and walked onto the field during practice and joined the game. Since O'Reilly was long and familiar with softball, he showed all his skills and led the team to victory. This time, the young man managed to impress Rachel, and she finally agreed to go on a date with him. Their relationship developed rapidly, and Joe, by all means and available ways to show that he is ready for the beloved to literally roll mountains. He unexpectedly organized for his beloved a trip to the most romantic city in the world, Paris, and there, on top of the Eiffel Tower, he asked for her hand in marriage. Of course, Rachel could not resist, and answered him in agreement. Then the naive girl thought that she met a real prince from a magical fairy tale, with whom she will live a long and happy life. A few years later, the couple married, and then, one after the other, they had 2 sons in common. The couple moved to the quiet and picturesque Scottish province of Naul, where they purchased their own spacious, cozy home. It was the perfect place to raise their children. After the birth of their eldest son, Rachel left her job and became a housewife, devoting herself to the care of her husband and child. And 2 years later, the couple had a second son. So the young mother was completely absorbed by the heirs, and the main gainer in the family was Joe, who got a job in an advertising agency as a specialist in outdoor advertising. Those who were personally acquainted with the head of the family described him as a confident, purposeful, and not devoid of charming man. At work, he proved himself as a responsible, qualified specialist, punctual, and attentive. He was the first to arrive at the office, and always stayed late if the situation required it. Joe also continued to be active in sports, often stopping by the gym before the workday began, and in his and his wife's house, there were several exercise machines and a set of dumbbells. Over time, when the boys grew up a little and began to attend kindergarten, Rachel, in order to have their own additional income, became a distributor for one of the popular cosmetics companies and also sold household goods. Such work allowed her to communicate more with neighbors, who spoke of her as a wonderful mother, a kind and open person. As time went on, Joe became less and less likely to come home. In fact, he came only to sleep, shower, and change his clothes. This behavior he wrote off the total employment at work and the upcoming promotion, which he was so looking forward to. His wife supported him as best she could, but gradually they began to drift apart, and family relations deteriorated markedly. In the summer of 2004, there was one extremely unpleasant event. An anonymous person sent a letter to Child Protective Services, which stated that Rachel is a bad mother and mistreats her sons, who at that time were 4 and 2 years old. In this regard, a special commission visited the couple's home and responded to the disturbing report. Although nothing suspicious was found, and all relatives and neighbors described Mrs. O'Reilly as a loving and caring mother, the letter cast a shadow on her reputation. What happened to Rachel O'Reilly? The morning of Monday, October 4th, 2004, began as usual. The head of the family left the house at dawn, while his wife and sons were still asleep, and went to work. Throughout the day, he texted and called his wife several times, but there was no answer. Then he called his home phone, but the answering machine went off, and Joe said in a shaky voice that he was very worried and asked his wife to call him back as soon as possible. In the afternoon, Joe received a call from the kindergarten teacher saying that Rachel had not come to pick up the boys, which had never happened before. Then Joe called his mother-in-law and asked if she knew where Rachel was, and when she said no, he asked Rose to go to their house and see if everything was all right. In the meantime, he went to the kindergarten to pick up the children. When Rose arrived at her daughter's home, she saw her car in the yard and realized that Rachel was home. However, the room itself was dark and quiet, and no one answered her call. The first thing that caught Rose's eye was the clutter, as if the house had been searched for something. Cabinets and drawers were open, their contents strewn on the floor. The whole thing looked like a robbery. The landlady was nowhere to be found, but when her mother entered the bedroom, a horrifying picture appeared before her eyes. Rachel was lying on the floor in a huge pool of her own blood. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, furniture, and even the ceiling. And through Rachel's bloody, tangled hair, in some places the bare bones of her skull could be seen. Rose rushed to her daughter, hoping she was still alive and could be helped, but when she touched her arm, she felt the limb was cold and stiff. Rachel had been dead for hours, and there was no way to help her. Unable to remember herself, Rose started screaming and calling for help, and then rushed to the phone to call the police. At her screams, the neighbors, among whom was a doctor, came running. He was the first to examine the body and confirmed that Rachel could not be helped. When Joe arrived at the house, there was already a crowd of people there. When he learned that his spouse was dead, he screamed and ran inside, saying he didn't believe it. In the bedroom, by his wife's body, he became hysterical. O'Reilly cried, screamed, and promised to kill whoever had done this to his beloved wife. According to police officers who arrived on the scene, they have never seen a more brutal picture of the massacre of a defenseless woman in their practice. Obviously, the weapon of the crime was some heavy, blunt object, which Rachel was beaten with incredible ferocity. There's literally nothing left on her body. Apparently, the owner of the house was attacked from behind because she did not even try to resist or fight back. The overall picture really resembled a robbery, but professional instinct told the investigators that such a beating only with personal motives or acute dislike. But who would have a hand on a petite young woman and mother of 2 children? The first thing detectives did was to interview family members and neighbors of the deceased. All of them confidently stated that Rachel had no enemies or ill-wishers, and that she was on friendly terms with everyone. Neighbors on that day did not notice anything suspicious. No strange cars or any strangers near the victim's house. Joe stated that he had been at the bus depot on the other side of town most of the day, where he had gone for work, and his alibi could be confirmed by a co-worker. The co-worker did confirm Joe's words, but the police were still haunted by vague doubts. Something was definitely wrong here. The situation looked like a robbery, but nothing of value had been taken, only scattered items. In the bedside table of the bedroom, almost in plain sight, lay 1,000 euros, which remained untouched. Another stash was in a kitchen cupboard, but this too was untouched. There was also a jewelry box on the dressing table, but only a pair of chains and earrings were missing, lying separately in a drawer. In addition, according to the homeowner, a digital camera, silverware, and one of his dumbbells, which was probably the weapon of crime, were missing. It all seemed too strange. The house was turned upside down, the landlady brutally murdered, and all this over some little thing. Joe, answering police questions, was crying, shaking, and feverish, but as one of the investigators later admitted, It seemed to him that such a state of the guy was not grief or shock at all, but rather like nervous excitement. O'Reilly behaved even more strangely when asked if his wife might have had an affair on the side. Joe changed his face and confidently stated that there was no such thing, and then added that he had not cheated on his wife, but this phrase sounded very unconvincing. 2 miles from the scene of the crime, in the bushes, was found a bag with things missing from the house. Inside was a camera, silverware, and a couple of pieces of jewelry. All items were from the list of stolen items that Joe had compiled. Now the robbery theory could be dismissed completely, and the case could be reclassified as premeditated murder. Suspicious widower. In spite of all the widowed fellow's attempts to portray grief and pain, it looked fake, and he immediately became the main suspect. Joe had nothing to present yet, but the detectives had to check his alibi in detail to study the scene of the crime and learn about their relationship with his wife. Joe said that in the morning before work, he decided to stop by the gym, which he did regularly, and the surveillance cameras in the parking lot, as well as in the gym itself, confirmed it. He then drove to the office, and from there he went to a bus station in a remote part of the city in order to monitor the placement of advertisements on vehicles. His words were confirmed by a colleague with whom he allegedly called at the time. The investigators then went to Joe's workplace, where they seized his computer for inspection. This is where the most interesting part began, because the email contained strange correspondence, which Joe had partially deleted. Specialists were able to recover the deleted messages, and the police were finally convinced that they were going in the right direction. Most often, Joe corresponded with his friend and his own sister, and to both of them he constantly complained about his wife. He wrote about Rachel using insults and profanity. He wrote that his wife had not attracted him as a woman for a long time, and in general causes him outright disgust. Moreover, the computer found another curious correspondence between Joe and one of his colleagues, a woman named Nikki Pelly. From their communication, it was clear that these two were much closer than just friends, and they should both be questioned. Who's Nikki Pelly? Nikki also worked for an advertising company, and she and Joe had a lot of work-related interactions. The woman was 10 years older than Joe, but that didn't stop them from having an affair. When exactly began their workplace romance, it was not possible to establish, but it was at her Joe spent evenings and even nights, and his wife lied about the fact that too busy with work. But this was not the strangest thing in the discovered correspondence. It turned out that Joe had promised Nikki in his messages that they would soon be together. He, she, and their sons, referring to his children with Rachel. Such messages were more than suspicious because in the event of a divorce, the boys would be left to live with their mother. Joe, who initially claimed that he had no affairs on the side, realized that it was pointless to deny it, because irrefutable evidence of his infidelity was found. Then he admitted that he had indeed been secretly dating Nikki for a while, but then they allegedly broke up. For more than a week, the O'Reilly house was cordoned off as a crime scene, and no one was allowed in because the police needed to scrutinize and document everything. During this time, Joe was staying with his sister and the boys were staying with their grandparents. At the funeral, Joe didn't look like a grieving widower. He acted remarkably calm, and most importantly, as if he was shunning the coffin with his late wife. When it was his turn to say goodbye, he did so quickly, coldly, and as he left, he indifferently said that the coffin could be closed and buried. When the family was allowed to return home, everything there looked as it had on the day of the crime, except for the body on the floor. Joe asked his father-in-law and mother-in-law to go with him, and they agreed, figuring he needed the support. On the spot, however, the son-in-law suddenly began to speculate about how the killer might have dealt with Rachel. He walked around the room in which his wife had been murdered and described how she had been attacked, the force with which she had been struck, pointing each time to dried blood spatters. Joe then suggested that the perpetrator might have gone to the bathroom to wash the blood off his hands and the crime weapon, which he then took with him. His account was horrifyingly detailed and full of detail, with Joe also waving his arms around to mimic the blows. However, his grief-stricken parents wrote off his behavior as an attempt to relieve stress and talk it out. Although Rose later admitted that all this time she did not let go of the idea that the son-in-law repeats the actions committed by him earlier, and it was he who massacred their daughter. Thirst for fame. Almost immediately after the funeral, O'Reilly began to actively communicate with the press, giving interviews left and right. He willingly invited reporters to his home, literally arranging them tours of the scene of the crime, and described how everything happened.
At the same time, Joe every time on camera addressed the criminal, offering him to voluntarily surrender to the police. 3 weeks after the tragedy, the loved ones of the deceased agreed to participate in the shooting of a TV program devoted to this crime. But if Rachel's parents were depressed and literally killed by grief, then Joe on the set behaved as if he was a star. He vividly communicated with the makeup artists, interested in how he will look like in the frame, and in the breaks eagerly nibbled on the proposed treats, drinking their coffee. The police, who were still looking at Joe, decided to follow him, and found that from the set he went straight to his mistress, Nikki, who spent the night. By that time, the last doubts that he was the killer had already been dispelled, and it remained only to collect irrefutable evidence for the court. Gathering evidence was a very long, complicated, and painstaking process because the most important thing, the instrument of the crime, was not found. Nevertheless, there was enough other evidence. The first to speak were Nikki and the colleague who had confirmed Joe's alibi. They were both facing jail time for perjury, so they decided not to risk their freedom. Nikki admitted that she and Joe had not broken up at all, as they claimed earlier, but continued their relationship. Moreover, about their connection found out Rachel, because of which the spouses had a big scandal on the eve of the tragedy. The colleague, however, said that he was not sure whether Joe was at the time of his wife's murder at the bus station on the other side of the city. The guy simply confirmed his friend's words at his request, not knowing at the time that O'Reilly was a suspect in the crime. Recovered correspondence from Joe's computer, in which he insulted his wife and planned his future with his mistress and children, was also attached to the case. The police also examined numerous interviews with Joe and footage from the TV program and concluded that he described the crime in the kind of detail that only a criminal could know. In part, it was the widower's careless remarks that made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of the crime. In the morning, he really went to the gym, deliberately getting into the lenses of all the cameras there. Then he also warned his colleagues that he would be absent from the office because he would leave for work in another part of the city and his phone may not be available. Then he went not to the bus station, as he said, but to his home, where he armed himself with a dumbbell and hid in the marital bedroom, waiting for his wife, who had left to take the children to kindergarten. He attacked her suddenly, from behind, leaving no chance of escape. After the massacre, Joe, as he himself admitted, washed off the blood from himself and the murder weapon in the bathroom adjacent to the bedroom. The perpetrator then changed his clothes, scattered his belongings around the house to simulate a robbery, and went to work. On the way, he threw the items away and disposed of the soiled clothes and dumbbells so that they would not be found. He also thoughtfully called his already murdered wife's cell phone several times, sent her a couple of messages and recorded voicemails on the answering machine, asking her to call him back. In the office, he was acting strangely and looked overexcited, and his hands were shaking slightly. Some of his colleagues noticed this and asked if he was all right. But Joe was confused, and instead of answering, he hurried to his office, where he soon received a call from the daycare center, informing him that the boys had not been picked up. He did not hurry to go home, but instead sent his mother-in-law to be the first to find his daughter's disfigured body. He thought he had thought of everything, and that his guilt would be impossible to prove, but his thirst for fame and public attention played against him. Joe was not taken into custody until 2 years after his crime. Despite the fact that most of the evidence was circumstantial, Joe's guilt was proved by reconstructing the entire route of his movements that day on the signal of a cell phone, with which he did not part. It is noteworthy that at the time of Rachel's murder, Joe's cell phone signal came from the family home. It was verified later with the help of billing. In addition, it was revealed at trial that the anonymous letter to Child Protective Services was written by Joe's mother at the request of her son. Joe knew that he would not have sole custody of the boys in the event of a divorce, so he tried to smear his wife by making her look like a bad and abusive mother. But social services officials found no corroboration for what the anonymous message said, so O'Reilly decided to act, for sure. He felt no remorse. He smiled in the courtroom, talked animatedly with his defense attorneys, and even tried to joke, believing that he would be released anyway. But in the summer of 2007, the court found Joe guilty and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The lawyers tried to challenge this decision, but all their complaints and appeals were rejected. It is noteworthy that the relationship between Joe and Nikki continued even after the guy went to prison. His mistress visited him regularly for many years, but in 2022, for unknown reasons, they stopped communicating. Joe O'Reilly never pleaded guilty. In prison, he has become a model inmate who never causes any trouble, hoping to achieve parole eligibility one day.